And we're live. Anthony, welcome back, man.
Thanks for having me again, Fran.
If there's one thing that my listeners have been asking me about fucking relentlessly is for you to come back, number one, but to talk about the mythology, because we kind of skipped that almost in the first episode.
Yes, we talked about a lot of ologies.
We certainly did.
Yeah.
Oh, I got a word. Oh, he'll kill me if I can't think of it. Oh. And was it an omniologist? Omniology?
Omni, as in...
Multi or...
Yeah, something for everything, as it were.
I think it was omniologist. That's Daniel Gavin, Gaza, a past
As
guest
in
and friend of
multiple.
the show.
Omni is multiple, isn't it?
I think so, yeah.
Very good. Omniology.
So, omniology, yeah.
Yeah.
My first omniologist as a guest.
But curiously, Mythical Ireland, we spent 3 hours talking and didn't really talk about mythology.
Yeah, exactly. Not at all. Not at all. Now, people were fascinated. They loved it and they wanted you back. But, yeah, absolutely what the recurring theme was, get them to talk about the mythology.
Yeah.
So where do we start?
Well, probably a very good starting point is to talk about when my own interest in mythology really began.
Yeah.
Which is, I can remember exactly when it was. It was January of 1999, which is that 19 years? Yeah, it'll be 20 years next January, when I met Richard Moore, who's an artist based in Drogheda. And you see, Richard came to me because he was an artist, but he wanted to know more about astronomy. Because he'd heard from people in Drogheda that I was interested in astronomy and I knew what I was talking about, apparently, allegedly. That has to come with a little disclaimer. So he came to me and said, I'd like to learn a little about astronomy. And then he started to talk to me about the megalithic monuments, which I was interested in anyway. And then he starts talking about mythology, because it turns out he has a good knowledge of the myths pertaining to the monuments. And I suppose from the get-go, we worked together for 8 years on Island of the Setting Sun, which is my first book, He was my co-author, effectively. And the two of us were just totally engrossed in the whole thing. So I taught him astronomy, and he opened up my interest in mythology. So that's where it began. And I didn't realise growing up, and I don't think a lot of people do realise how much mythology we have. I think I did mention that in the last interview, that we have a huge body of myth and folklore, massive amounts of it, to rival the richest mythologies of the world, basically. And so much stuff that's sitting in manuscripts and hasn't been translated or isn't, let's say, widely studied or widely available. Some of it has been popularised. So you can buy books pertaining to the Toynbee Culling and stuff like that, and everybody's heard of the Children of Lear, for instance. Most people have heard of the story of Finn McCool and the Salmon of Knowledge, but that's really the tip of the iceberg, and the iceberg goes very deep. So I learned that not only was there a huge body of mythology, but there was a great deal of it that pertained to Newgrange and Louth and Douth and, the Boyne Valley region. So it was like a roller coaster, really, Really, really got stuck into it. And I mean, born out of that was this huge tome. Island is by far the most comprehensive of the three major books that I've written. I think it runs to about 100,000 words, It's the equivalent of a thesis,
Yeah.
And that was born out of this relentless search for mining the information that was contained in the myths and in the archaeological records, and trying to tie that all in with astronomy. It was really quite magical, quite an uplifting period of research. And to be honest, although myself and Richard aren't sort of in close contact now, it's not that we've fallen out or anything. We just, we don't have that same level of contact that we had during those years. That has led really to, it led to the creation of Mythical Ireland as an entity, as the website, and it has really led to everything else I've done since, because I've just become hooked on it. I just can't. I can't let it off the lead, to use your own phrase. I can't let the fish away,
Yeah.
I'm like a salmon fisherman down along the Boyne, and I've hooked a big salmon, and I want to reel him in, and I want to hold him in my hand and see what he's like. Now I might release him afterwards, but I'm on the heel of the hunt, as it were, and I think there's a huge amount of stuff that I still haven't discovered either.
But I think that's great for you, great for your kind of mental well-being. And I only spoke about today this idea of your approach circuitry in the brain. It's dopaminergically activated, or dopamine is the neurochemical that's basically being produced when you're in exploring mode. So just that kind of hunt for knowledge and it not being there, like you couldn't just, for a start, you couldn't Google anything back then. Really, could you? What,
No.
99?
Well,
The best part of 20 years ago?
I'm
Not like we had it today, anyway.
I'm trying to remember when Google began, because I remember using it when I worked in the Drogheda Independent, and I worked there until 2002. So certainly the internet, I think, was in its earliest period. I mean, I set up mythicalireland.com in March of 2000.
Okay.
And Google definitely did exist then. But yeah, I mean, the internet was fledgling, and it wasn't the resource that it is today. And none of what's available today was available. So, for instance, an awful lot of the old manuscripts and translations are actually now available online. Archive.org is a fabulous website.
Right.
So all of the Dindshenicus is on there, for instance.
And forgive my ignorance, but what is that?
That's the collection of myths about eminent places in Ireland. So myths about the Hill of Tara, myths about Newgrange, myths about the Hill of Slane, and a host of different places as to where they got their names. It's place name mythology.
Right.
Now, a lot of it was translated by Edward Gwynn and published in the early part of the 20th century. But you see, while researching for Island of the Setting Sun, I had to go to libraries and source that and make copies and write notes and all the rest. Now, from the comfort of my own home, I can just download a PDF and leaf my way through it. Incredible,
Yeah, no, absolutely. But getting back to the actual mythology, is there... What's even the best way to phrase it? Like you mentioned the last day, the Tuatha De Danann.
Yeah.
They were the ancient gods. Am I right in saying that?
Yes.
And was there a first one of them, or did they all rise at the same time, or what way did that play out? And is that even a good approach to talking about the mythology?
Well, it is, yeah. I've taken a particular interest in mythology that would be described as cosmological, so relating to not just the astronomical aspect, the sun, the moon and the stars, but cosmological as in, how we relate to cosmos and how we see ourselves as part of something greater. And also I've taken a big interest in creation mythology, so the early mythology, what I consider to be the earliest myths, stuff that I think, by the way, predates Newgrange. But there's no easy way to approach it because there's so much. The Tuatha De Danann belong to a sort of a body of mythology that would be described as in the invasion mythology. Okay. Because according to a manuscript, now remember that most of our myths were written down by monks in the medieval period, so in the last millennium.
Okay, I wouldn't have even known that.
Yeah, but they had survived by word of mouth up to that point, and we don't know how far back some of these stories go, but we can take some educated guesses. But the invasion myths belong to a book called Leber Gabála, or Laur Gawala, as it would be pronounced in modern Irish, and that is the Book of the Takings of Ireland, or the Book of Invasions as it's commonly known, and it chronicles a series of arrivals in Ireland, both before and after the Great Flood. Now you have to understand that because these myths were transcribed by monks, there is a Christian influence in them.
Yes.
And the Christian influence of the Laur Gawala is that it basically tries to tie in Ireland's genetic history, I suppose, with some of the biblical figures. So, for instance, the first person to arrive in Ireland shortly before the flood was Kezer, who's said to have been a granddaughter of Noah. And she came here. He wouldn't let her onto the ark, Noah's ark. So he told her to go to Ireland because he said that he considered that Ireland would not be subject to God's judgment because nobody lived there, therefore there was no sin in Ireland. So it was unlikely that Ireland would be part of God's punishment. So Kildare travelled with 2 other women. Sorry, I'm wrong about that. No, it's Kildare travelled with 150 women and 3 men.
Lucky guys.
You would imagine, but you see what happens is that 2 of the gentlemen die. There's an excess of women, and I think part of the reason the two others die is because they're judged by this, a fearsome Old Testament God for having indulged in too much of the old hanky-panky with the ladies, Anyway, the long and short of it is that the flood does actually come to Ireland, and they're all drowned except for one of the men, and he is Fintan MacBocra. And Fintan is sort of like an ancestor figure, the lone survivor of the flood. And part of the reason he survives, according to the tale, is because he didn't partake in the excesses, the physical and lust didn't seize him, as it were, with the ladies, and thus he is freed of God's judgment. It's a very interesting story because obviously, a lot of it is allegorical. However, can we rule out the possibility that there was a great flood? Is the great flood myth something that is just part of a creation myth, or does it pertain to actual events? And of course, in Fingerprints of the Gods, Graham Hancock, that gentleman we spoke about the last time, mentioned that there are something like 500 different versions of the Noah's Ark myth from diverse cultures around the world. So in other words, the myth of a man or several humans surviving this great flood on an ark with animals and then seeding the new world is not unique to the Bible, But Fintan survives in a place called Tultinge, which I believe is in modern-day Tipperary, on the top of a mountain. And in order to avoid the flood, he turns into a salmon, and then afterwards into an eagle, and then into a hawk. So he's a sort of a changeling. And he's fascinating because he becomes important in later myths as a sort of a gentleman or a figure who has lived almost forever. He's immortal to an extent. He lives for 5,000 years throughout the histories of Ireland, and he's occasionally consulted for his great wisdom, Curiously enough, the story of the salmon of knowledge, which was caught in the Boyne, in the bend of the Boyne near Rossnaree, but not far from Nouth and Newgrange. In one version of that story, the salmon is named, and the salmon's name is Fintan. So it's sort of the same sort of idea. But so you have to start with the Book of Invasions. So there's the Kildare and her entourage who are killed, and then the Partholon and his people come, and they suffer a similar fate in that they come to Ireland and they settle here, but after a while they're struck down by a plague and it kills them all. And you know where they're all buried? Do you know Tala in Dublin?
I do.
Well, Tala is from the Irish Tala Muncher Partholon, which means the graves of the people of Partholon.
Right.
Because mythically that is the place where they were all supposed to have been buried when they were struck down by the plague. So the Dedannans are later arrivers. They descend from the air in ships, in a mist, in the west of Ireland. Now, some scholars maintain that the mist is caused by the fact that they burn their ships when they land. So they land at a place, I think it's called Dunmark, which I think means the fort of the ships, but I could be mistaken, and I'm not an Irish scholar. And that the smoke is what actually caused the mist.
And is that a well-known thing? Like, were the Vikings known to do that, or someone else?
Possibly. That's actually a good question. I'm not sure. But all I can say is that the the fact that they descended from the sky has led some people to speculate that we're talking about aliens, you know.
Of course. It's the
And
go-to.
that's inevitable, you know. It's like, it doesn't always, you know, what we were talking about last time, and the whole thing about metaphor and allegory, you know. After the Dedanans, now the Dedanans are the ones closely associated with the monuments, with the she, as they're called. So the old Irish word for what might know as a fairy mound, or today an archaeologist might call a passage tomb. They were called she, S-I fada D in Old Irish, sheed, or S-I fada D-H-E in Modern Irish.
And is that what I've heard you refer to Newgrange as?
Yeah,
is it
sheed in Broga, yeah.
Okay.
So that's its name in the ancient stories until such time as Angus takes ownership of it, and then it becomes Brug Mac on the Og, which means the brew or the mansion of the son of the young. Angus Mac on Og is his full title, or Angus Og as he becomes known. So the Dedanans were the ones who were said to have distributed the mounds to the various principal deities of the Tuatha De Danann. So just to give you a little bit of background to that.
And sorry, just before you do, so there was the old guy that lived for 5,000 years. What was his name again?
Fintan MacBorcra.
Fintan MacBorcra, who turned into a salmon and then a hawk and then an eagle or whatever it was. And then in the not too distant future, the Danans landed on the west coast in ships from the sky and whatever else. And now we're moving on to.
Well, I have to go on before I go back to the to the Danann, because next to arrive are the Milesians.
Okay.
And they're so called, because they're called after the King of Spain, whose name is Mil, M-I-L. And Mil actually means soldier, and his name was translated as Soldier of Spain. And they came basically to take Ireland from the Dedanans. And there were some fearsome battles between the Milesians and the Dedanans, including one at Teltown, which is not too far from where we are here, actually. Talche, the Battle of Talche. At the end of which the Dedanans reach an accord with the Milesians. They basically tell them, look, go back out to sea, and if you can land again, then we'll give you the country. So they go out to sea by a distance of 9 waves, according to Laura Gowalla. 9 waves. So I don't know what that is, you know. How many fathoms is that, you know? Is that half a mile? You know? Is it 300 yards? I don't really know. It's funny. And what happens is Manannán, who's the sea god, and he's, by the way, one of the principal deities of the Dedanans, raises a fierce storm. And so I've drawn attention to this. I'm not sure if I'm the only one that's done it, but I think it's really peculiar that there's this myth about a whole load of warriors who arrive from Spain in ships, and their fleet is half wrecked at sea. Now it's off, I think, the east coast, because they eventually arrive in the Boyne Estuary. But it's a Spanish armada,
of course.
Long before the other Spanish armada takes place.
And speaking of the timeline, so when, roughly within, what are you talking? Are you talking tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years?
Look, this is pseudo history. So this is mythology, really. The curious thing about the Book of Invasions is that, the annals try to date some of these things. So the annals date the arrival of the Milesians to approximately 1694 BC, which would be Bronze Age,
Okay.
Which would be about 1,500 years after Newgrange was built. But the archaeological record and the Laura Gowalla don't tally, except for that, yes, as an island nation, we have undergone several waves of invasions throughout our history.
Yes.
And undoubtedly the arrival of farming, which precipitated the construction of the passage mounds, was one of those invasions. Whether it was an armed thing or an insurrection, I don't think so. I think it was more likely just an influx of new ideas. So the two things correlate, but they don't correlate historically, as it were.
Okay, so in relation to agriculture, presumably these myths don't predate agriculture, or do they? Now,
this is where we could spark a whole little rabbit hole. We could go down a rabbit hole here, So I do want to talk I'd like to talk at some stage about a couple of myths that I believe might be pre-Neolithic. But for the moment, just to stay on point, I think we're dealing with stuff that, as I said, was written down 1,000 years ago, medieval times. and the provenance of which we can't know for sure, orally and verbally, except for that there are some aspects of the stories that would hint at knowledge of the monuments, particularly Newgrange, in its early state, before the collapse that we spoke about the last time, which would indicate that there's something within those myths that pertains to the earliest times, even if some aspects of the myths are undoubtedly later. So, for instance, today I wrote a blog post about a curious story called Altram Chia Gá Weather, which translates as the fosterage of the houses of the two drinking vessels. That pertains to Newgrange. It's a story based largely at Newgrange and pertains to some of the chief deities of the Daedanans, including the aforementioned Manannán and Aengus Og and Elkmar, who was the then owner of Newgrange. And so it mentions these milking vessels that... so there's two women in the story. One is the daughter of Manannán, and she's named Kirkog, which is the Irish for beehive, apparently. And the other is the daughter of the steward of Newgrange. The chief steward of Newgrange's name is Dichu, D-I-C-H-U. And his wife gives birth to a daughter who's named Ethna. And she's supposedly a Daedanan goddess, you know. And some scholars have said Ethna is another name for Boin, who would have been the sort of chief female deity of the Boyne Valley, from whom the river Boyne is named Boyne. So the vessels are described as being golden, you know. So you look at the metal and you think, well, that's obviously, you know, the person who's writing in medieval times is using, you know, medieval language and descriptions to describe concepts that might have changed over time, but some aspects of the stories remain the same. Anyway, the Milesians finally land, their ship's half broken and half of them killed, and Amergin, that guy we talked about the last time, Amergin, Brightoney, lands on the Boyne estuary and claims it for the Daedanans. And they reach an accord with the two Daedanan, that is, that we're going to take the country and you're going to take the other world, as it were.
And sorry, you said he landed at the Boyne estuary and claimed Ireland, but I thought the Daedanan were in Ireland already.
Yes,
no?
they were.
Okay.
What I'm saying is that because they landed again, the
Milesians landed again.
Well, yes, for the second time. Do you remember I was saying after their first skirmishes with the Daedanans, they
were sent out 9 waves?
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
And if they could land again, the Daedanans were going to agree to let them have Ireland. But you see, it was kind of a tryst, or it was kind of a... there was a twist in the tale, as it were, because it seemed that the Daedanans were vanquished, when in actual fact they were taking the Sidhe, which were, I think, they were granting themselves a sort of immortality, really, because the Sidhe were the portals to these other worlds, to these heavenly realms, the land of promise, the land of youth, Tir na Og, you know, all that stuff. While the Milesians, they could venture out into the mortal world and not be seen here.
But they were gods, am I right in saying that? Or
it's difficult to say exactly what they were, you know. Were they deified ancestors, which is what some people think they were, you know.
And so you mentioned a minute ago that one of them was maybe not the god of the sea, but was Manannán. So there was, let's say Manannán was the sea guy. Was there a storm guy? Was there a river guy? Was there how many of them was there?
To an extent. So for instance, Dagda I very much see as a solar deity, you know, and I've written about that in my books. Not so sure about storm deities, but there are similarities between some of the figureheads of the Daedanans and some of the figureheads that you encounter in, for instance, Norse and Greek mythology. So like a lot of scholars have drawn similarities between Lu and certain, European deities, as it were. So you do see similarities. I think where it differs is that Ireland is so insular. I mean, we're so cut off from everything else that I think there's just always a unique twist. There's always a unique factor to our stories, although some of them would appear to share a lot in common with myths from other parts of the world. Anyway, the Daedanans are agree to give the Milesians Ireland, and they inhabit the Shee. This is not the end of them by any means, and the prophecy in folklore is that the Danans will return from the Shee at a time of great need to rescue Ireland, or to bring Ireland to glory at a time of great struggle. Some folklore speaks about, some great end of the world event, some great battle that happens in the valley of the Black Pig, when the Black Pig runs again, and that's the time that the Danans will emerge from the Shee. So, there's all sorts of stuff there, like the cosmological aspects of the mythology. What does it mean for deities to basically go underground? So is that to do with a part of the Irish psyche which is prone to allowing invasions to take place unfettered, if you follow me?
Yeah.
And I've drawn similarities to the myth of the Danans and the Milesians in the Laragawala in my Newgrange book, to the time when sovereignty of Ireland was handed over to the Troika not too long ago.
Yeah.
After the collapse of the economy.
I remember
within the past decade, that, we have this meek tendency as a people sometimes just to allow this stuff to happen, as if we're almost powerless to do anything about it. And sure, you only have to look at the last 1,000 years of our history to see that play out very strongly, You
could obviously argue the opposite, that, what did they say? Out of the British essentially rule the world, but they couldn't they couldn't conquer the island closest to them. Between that and the whole fighting Irish thing that you hear so much about as well, so that would, in a sense, contradict what you're saying about our meek nature. Now, granted, I get where you're coming from, but I just wonder how you would reconcile those two.
Yeah. Curveball. Yeah, thanks, Fran, for throwing me completely off. I think that one of the things that the British occupation did that was quite clever was an attempt to is this a word? Deculturize, to anglicize our place names, to
ban the language and all the rest of it.
Yeah, there was a serious effect of the mass emigration of the famine, was that an awful lot of the folklore and the mythology emigrated with that, especially in parts of the west and northwest. And then even to the extent that a lot of us started to speak English, and so we lost a lot of the myth and the nuances that would have been present through our own language in those myths, because a translation is never the same.
No,
like an awful lot of the Dinchanicus is metrical. It's poetry basically. It's prose in the form of poetry. It's written in a way that the Irish appears to rhyme, or there's a rhythm to it, and that rhythm is broken, of course, when you translate it. So there were sort of very serious and detrimental effects to the mythology. I think we're very lucky that we've ended up with what we have, given everything that happened.
Of course.
I think we still have a huge body of stuff, which includes a lot of the material that was collected by the Folklore Commission. Again, I think we spoke about that the last time, in the early part, in the 1930s especially, because it was recognised that the oral and folk tradition was dying. So it was important to save as much of that as possible. So I think in that regard, we're lucky to have ended up with what we ended up with. Of course, for great periods of our later history, the material that's in the manuscripts was inaccessible. you have to understand that a lot of that has been translated only in the last couple of centuries.
And sorry, when you say manuscripts,
Well, I'm talking about all of that stuff that was written down by the monks.
okay,
You know,
the Book of Kells type stuff, or am I off saying that?
yeah. Well, the Book of Kells is biblical. I'm talking about the Irish mythology that was written down in the likes of the Book of the Dun Cow and the Book of Leinster, etc., etc.
And again, forgive my ignorance, but are these artifacts that we have in museums, or are they things that you've heard of, or?
Yeah, no, we have some of them, and some of them are in the British library as well, in different collections. But you know, they've been, some of them, or a lot of them, have been translated. So the Táin, for instance, as we know it, is translated from two recensions or two versions that are contained in two different manuscripts. The Dingenicus, I think, is largely contained in the Book of Leinster. You know, so this stuff is only approximately 1,000 years old, allegedly. You know, medieval mythology, but it's not medieval. You know, a lot of it's much earlier. But sure, can you prove that? Well, I don't know. We spoke the last time about the myth, the folk stuff about Newgrange in the 1960s that later turned out to be true. It was proven by the archaeological work, you know. So there are certainly aspects of the stories that, as I say, contain information that would appear to go back, but yet the stories seem to be set in a medieval time frame, as in, you know, the weaponry and the clothing and the material possessions of some of the myths.
Of course,
kind of belie a medieval time frame.
Yes, know? And they might betray the ancientness, say, or the age of the actual origins of the stories.
Yeah, effectively, yeah.
So we had the Tuatha De Dan, and then how did we get talking about the meekness of the Irish?
Well, I was just drawing attention to the fact that, you know, the Troika,
of course,
basically took control of the country without too much of a protest from the government of the day, and the public found out almost by accident, thanks to the diligence of the press. You know, I don't think the government was going to even tell us what had happened, except for they were pressed by various members of the journalistic profession to do so. So I just drew parallels to that in my Newgrange book, which was written in 2012, which I found was a time of great reflection in Ireland, a time when we were sort of, you know, well, we were trying to, I think we had, you know, suffered the scandals of the church, and the political establishment had, well, the old order had collapsed, really, with the collapse of the economy. And then, you know, the economy itself was in tatters. So people were reaching out and searching for stuff, you know, and searching for meaning, as it were. And some of those people found that the older myths and the older sacred sites gave them something in the darkness, as it were. Might sound a little bit aloof or a little bit strange, but certainly that was my experience, and I found that around that time, people who were coming to the likes of Newgrange and the Hill of Tara were actually seeking for that little something different, or something deeper, should I say, because they had suffered something of a loss of soul as a result of all of the things that had happened. So a lot of people suddenly found themselves powerless, unable to pay bills and pay a mortgage, wondering how they were going to feed their kids and all that stuff, you know.
Oh yeah, well, I know myself. Like I suffered terribly with depression after I had the rug pulled out from under me, essentially, when everything collapsed. I was involved in the construction industry, and I think a lot of people lost their sense of identity.
Yeah,
and that's why they kind of went searching for, whether it was the mythology, or even now, like Ivor McQuillan, a guy I've had on twice, he speaks of the use of psychedelics and, you know, getting in touch with the spirit world, and he's by far my biggest draw, say. And it's the people that, it's between himself and yourself, they seem to be the top two favourites of people that I've had on, and I think it's no accident. I think it pertains to exactly the point that you're making now, that people are they're searching for something.
You see, we have to move past the notion that mythology is mere storytelling. You know, myth contains something that comes from the depth of the human spirit and the human experience of life and all of its awesomeness and all of its challenges and all of its difficulties. So at the core of a country or nation's myth is something that helps it, that nurtures it, that in essence brings it through the dark times, as it were. I don't think it's any coincidence that the folklore says the Dananns will come back, because I think that that's got to do, psychologically, is got to do with the retreat of our better natures into a place of darkness, in a situation where our existential, our actual existence is threatened. So the arrival of the Milesians marked a huge turning point for the Dananns, who thought themselves inconquerable and immortal. Now, they were right about the second one, because they were immortal to an extent, i.e., the mythology of the Dananns represents something that is latent within the spirit of people in general, Irish people, I think, because it's a peculiarly Irish set of myths, and that is something that we need to draw forth in times of difficulty. So I'm really not surprised that when the shit hit the fan and the economy collapsed, and with it, don't forget, this isn't just an economical thing. This happened in conjunction with the collapse of religion and in conjunction with the collapse of the political order. So since the Rising, two parties have dominated Irish politics, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and all of a sudden both seemed to have lost their grip. Now, only to an extent. Politics has become more fragmented in Ireland in a way that hasn't happened in some other European countries, because some other European countries disallow the small one seat or 2 seat parties from forming coalition governments, on the basis of how they tally the results, etc., etc. But so there was a collapse of a lot of things. And what are people to do in these situations? Well, one answer was migration. So we had almost a return to the 1980s for a time around 2010, I think 2011. There was mass youth emigration from Ireland. Yeah. And a huge number of those people are abroad permanently now.
What do they call it? Brain drain.
Brain drain, yeah, it's a great phrase, isn't it? But I just found, because I was dealing with the myths and the monuments, I found I encountered a lot of people in those years who were yearning for something, hankering for something. And it was as if, to me, something of their own Danann nature was reaching out from inside of them,
Well, there are stories. It's our mythology. Do you know that kind of way? Like it's our ancestors that were talking about this.
And what does that do? Like, what do you think that does for people? Why should people have any interest in their mythology?
I'm going to be reaching here now, but I think that you said it earlier there about the flood myths. We all, across the globe, we all came up with essentially the same reasonings for why things happened. Like if there was a famine, it was that the gods were angry with us for something that we did, or whether it was the flood myth, or whether it was the hero mythology, or the kind of the Virgin Mother. There's all these different things in mythology worldwide. Now, listen, you obviously know a lot more about that than I would, but the sentiment is the same, but the individual examples are slightly different. So somebody living in a desert land isn't going to have the same water god that somewhere like Ireland is going to have. So it's our weather, it's our climate is built into it, our terrain is built into it.
Yeah.
You're not going to have, like, they didn't have wheels in South America because of the terrain, so you're not going to have a lot of kind of chariot. You're not going to have gods on chariots charging down cities or whatever. So our own mythology is it's ours. It's in the landscape. It's in our climate. It's do you understand the point that I'm going to labouring to make? Admittedly,
Yeah. I was interested in, you're absolutely right about the fact that your mythology relates to your geography and your terrain and your surroundings and your climate, etc. Of course, yeah, absolutely, that's natural, isn't it? It is framed within its surroundings, its natural habitat, as it were. What I meant, no, was psychologically, why would people be interested in their mythology? Why was Carl Jung so interested in mythology? And I think the reason is that at its core, it contains, is it information? Is it some essence of our sort of eternal and deepest natures? That what is within us is almost as infinite as what is out there in the universe. Somebody said, I can't remember. Remember we were talking about butchering quotes the last time. Well, I'm using a quote now, and I haven't a clue who said it. That we're reaching to something that, you see, the reason most people, oh look, I'm generalizing now, but most people in the last, say, let's just talk about the last few millennia of human life on Earth, have been religious to an extent.
Very much so,
yeah. Most people around the world have practiced a religion or been part of some religion or spiritual movement.
Well, all peoples, I think. Has there been a tribe or a race or whatever, a group of people who haven't?
It's very difficult to say that there has. But what is the reason for that? Because we are seeking for the nuministic, the experience of the divine, or the experience of a mortal presence in our own lives. We are clutching to the hope and to the idea that beyond this corporeal form that we have, that is so damning for us, because we said the last time, you remember we were talking about the church and how it battered people about sin, and we had enough to deal with, which was our own corporeal death. This thing that we all face, this death that we face. So I think we clutch to hope that we are, in fact, somehow immortal, and that there's something after this life, and that we exist in the beyond. I think that's one of the things. But just, I think also the experience of the divine can come in the most simple things. So, for instance, for the builders of Newgrange, what was that? The experience of the divine, I think, one of those crystalline divine moments must have been when that shaft of sunlight entered that dark cave. And what a revelatory and illuminating and nuministic experience that must have been. A religious experience, an uplifting, powerful thing. To see this light in the darkness. And of course it's such a metaphor in world religions. Light in darkness, and the idea of, I suppose, hope, and that in the darkness of our own demise, that there'll be a light and a travel down that tunnel of light that we spoke about in the near-death experience to something powerful beyond, some sort of awesome gathering of conscious forces that is beyond the threshold of our own death. So I think that myth is far more than just fireside tale. Let's sit down and talk about, okay, some of it is, and undoubtedly you told stories to entertain, but they don't entertain if they don't have meaning. And how do they have meaning? Because we identify with the archetypal nature of some of the characters that we encounter in myths and some of the scenarios that we encounter. That allow us as ordinary mortal beings to transcend through to some sort of divine plane, that we can, for a moment even in our lives, be equal to whatever god or gods there might be, which is why a lot of the gods have very human characteristics, because they are basically reflections of our wish to have that eternal nature.
Are they also reflections of the archetypes? Are they reflections of our ideals? So let's say that they're something to strive for, and to I suppose to strive for, and at the same time be afraid of, because there's the hero in us all, say, but there's also the devil in us all. So that you have to be very careful that you don't go too far down one path. And I don't know, does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And from the last interview too, I think we spoke about Nectan's well and how Bowen approached the well even though she was told she shouldn't. And the Denchanica story says that none shall look to the bottom of the well. And I often ask the question, why should somebody not look to the bottom? Well, what should they fear about approaching the well and looking into it? And of course, in the Jungian analysis, that water represents the unconscious, and the peering into the water represents the peering into the unconscious. And when you encounter the unconscious forces, the difficulty is that they can erupt quite violently upon you and basically cause you to lose your mind, that sort of thing. And the danger is that in approaching the well, that we want to delve too far too soon into those deep aspects of ourselves. I think myth has a way of, and especially in the sort of more primitive cultures, and we don't have to go too far back in our own history to encounter primitive Irish people, you know. It's not that long ago since we didn't read and write, you know, and since our stories were all communicated by word of mouth and we didn't know what was fact or fiction.
But sure, everyone's great-great-great-grandfather was essentially a peasant.
Well, this is it, you know. I mean, my own grandparents, I've seen their details in my paternal grandfather's details in the census of 1906, or was it around that anyway, around the turn of the 20th century. And sure, look, half of the people who were who were counted for the census, the enumerator, is that the person who takes the details, was signing their name because they couldn't write their own name, you know.
Right.
So you don't have to go far back to encounter people for whom myth and fact were intertwined. Everything that came to them by way of knowledge was passed on orally from somebody in their community.
And do you think those stories back then, do you think that if we were a lot less intelligent than we are now, that the stories would be more relatable? Is there a kind of a base nature to them? Have we gone too far down the kind of academic intelligence?
Well, I think that's undoubtedly part of the reason that myth has lost its appeal, because we've become so analytical, and that we've lost to an extent that intuitive side of our nature that just understands that there's something important about telling this story, even if we don't necessarily understand it. I think that it's important to tell the stories because the meaning can percolate subconsciously. In other words, you're telling stories and you're listening to stories, and you're not consciously immediately aware of any great meaning to your life in them, but perhaps the meaning is transferred in some subconscious way.
I've heard an analogy to that. Me that loves my analogies, but to what I think you're talking about. So the idea is, if you have a group of school children, let's say first or second class, whatever age, 8 or 10 year olds, out playing a game of soccer together. They'll play all day. They play a game of soccer. You pull them in individually and ask them the rules, and individually none of them know all the rules, but collectively they do. Do you know that kind of way? So yes. Collectively, there's a collective unconscious as well, which I think Jung talked about as well.
Yeah.
So it might be percolating within you subconsciously, but at the same time it's percolating en masse amongst us all collectively. And the more that we kind of talk about it, the more that we trash it out, either consciously or subconsciously.
Yeah. I think that we are so analytical in nature now that we're only interested in the, we're only interested in analysing those aspects of the myths that can be analysed in that, subject to our criteria. you know, and that it's all very, you know, left-brained, and it's all very academic, and it's all very almost sort of materialistic in nature, you know, which is how life has kind of gone in, certainly in Western society. We're so enthralled by the alternatives. We spoke last time quite a bit about atheism in Ireland, but those who have left the traditional church, who are not atheists, what are they doing? I think a lot of them are reaching out to Eastern religious culture.
Very much so.
So we've got a lot of people who practice yoga and meditation and Buddhism and all sorts of stuff going on. The reason that won't serve them fully and wholly is because it wasn't by and large, you know, we have to talk about ethnicity here, that it wasn't their mythology to begin with. It wasn't part of their story. So our story, you know, is there for us to mine. It's there. Our myths are there to be retold.
Yeah, we're not of Buddhism, if that makes. We're not of the Eastern traditions. We're of our own Irish mythology.
Yeah, and I think that's something that the likes of, what's his name? Is it Alan Watts? He's very popular on, you know, he's dead now, but he's very popular on his books and on YouTube, etc. And I think he went to the East and studied all that and brought it back with him. But there seems to be a sort of almost a hedonism when it comes to, you know, that a search for a religious experience that has to be outside of your own culture, you know. It's almost as if people have denied, you know, I think in Ireland, for instance, a lot of people, this is a strange one. A lot of people perhaps see Irish myth and the Christianity and the Catholic Church as branches of the same thing, you know. I wonder why it is that an Irish person who has decided to opt out of the Christian Church should then adopt an Eastern philosophy
when they have their own homegrown stuff here.
Yeah. Now, I'm not suggesting people go out and buy druids costumes and bang drums and smoke weed and whatever you have to do to feel like you're a druid. I'm really not talking about that. I'm talking about a genuine immersion into their own story. And maybe they'll find something there. This all sounds very tenuous. I'm sure your listeners are saying, you know, he's rambling. And to an extent I am, I know, because we're just exploring ideas here. And you know, it's very important that people understand. I said this last time as well. I'm not academically trained in any way. My last qualification was my Leaving Cert. I don't have anything above and beyond my Leaving Cert. So it's important that people understand that. I'm not coming at this academically. It's an exploration, as this whole 20 years of writing books has been for me.
Well, I'm glad you threw that in there, because I was kind of conscious that somebody might be tuning into this as the first time hearing you speak, and then got into whatever minute we're in now and saying, wait a minute, who am I even listening to?
Yeah,
oh my God, I've just wasted whatever length of time it
Couldn't
is.
blame them for switching off.
I mean, Jesus, you've written, is it 3 books?
Well, 3 works of non-fiction plus 2 works of fiction.
Okay, so 3, and when you say non-fiction, it's all in and around
some
the
people
Irish
say my
mythology.
non-fiction is a bit fictional, but
well, look, it's got all the references and everything else.
Yeah.
So
No,
it is
exactly,
non-fiction, like.
Yeah.
So sorry, where were we? Or
well, I was just saying that, you know, this was an exploration of ideas.
Yeah,
so
very much so.
I'm inclined to follow my intuition, which I've done in all my work for the past 20 years.
Yeah.
And I think there's an intuitive aspect to mythology, you know. So what is mythology at its core? It speaks to us of human experience in life, addresses, I think, to an extent, some of the big questions of life, and attempts to put us in touch with, you know, our divine and eternal natures. Or at least I think that we're aspiring towards that with some of our mythology. We just happen to be very lucky as a people that we've got loads of it. We've got loads.
But we've almost got too much of it, though. Not that you could ever have too much, but what I mean is from a starting point. If somebody who wants to kind of get into it with Christianity, say, we got it shoved down our throat in primary school, so we kind of know all the stories. But I mean, here's my recap of Irish mythology. There's Fionn McCool, the Tuatha De Danann, there's Newgrange and other kind of monuments. There's Tír na Nog, is that?
Yeah.
There's Tír na Nog. I always get that mixed up with something out of Into the West.
I think, there are aspects of Tír na Nog in the Into the West
maybe that's
movie.
That's what it is. But again, I couldn't have even said that with any kind of certainty. And any time I think of something, I'm like, oh, did I see that on an Onion article or Water for Whisperers or in a movie or is this actually part of the mythology? So there was Tír na Nog, the Salmon of Knowledge. There was the giants. Is that Irish mythology or is that folklore? And is there
there are giants in Irish mythology, like the Fomorians, who were sort of like an evil race who the De Dananns battled with at the Second Battle of Moytura. Balor of the Evil Eye, who's mentioned in Island of the Setting Sun, is one of those. He's like a cyclops, And then the Fir Bolg, I think, were also supposedly supposed to have been giants as well. I'm interested in giants as a representation of something that is bigger than the human mind can comprehend in an ordinary human. So, in other words, it is something superhuman, So, the myths of the modern world are really contained in those popular books, such as the Harry Potter series and Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, and of course, similarly in movies. We find the myth of the world today locked up in popular culture, more so than our inherited culture. But what we don't realise is that intertwined with a lot of that popular culture are mythical themes and symbols and characters that come to us from the various mythologies of, mostly the European existence. I mean, nobody can read Tolkien without thinking they're reading some great, Celtic epic, some great European mythical story, really, because it's got shades of that. And I spoke last time about Star Wars and the fact that it's influenced by various world myths, including some Irish mythology, and then the fact that it appears to harbour within it a sort of a myth of the modern man. So I saw something in, I think it was Rogue One, where they're going to destroy the city of, is it Jeddah? And they're in the spaceship and they destroy it from space and send down this huge beam that blows up the city, and the devastation is catastrophic. It's akin to watching a nuclear explosion. And I just thought while I was watching that's a very powerful symbol for the existential angst that we spoke about last time, and that undoubtedly a lot of human beings are feeling right now about the possibilities. So they're as a very central image of some of our most popular movie mythology, shall we say, is an image of the potency of and the power of human beings. And I'm not just talking about a zeal and a religious awe and a wish to become like the ascetic Luke Skywalker who's off on his island in the latest movies, living the life of a hermit, and very much being like a medieval monk, as it were. I'm talking about that dangerous phase of our existence that we have entered in recent decades, where we have the potential to go completely off the rails, having lost our mythology, and to get into this mode of annihilation, which we have already entered on several occasions in the past few centuries.
So our mythology was an anchor to our sanity to a degree, or?
I think so. I think so, and I'm not the only one.
A grounding, say.
Yeah, a grounding. So, what is the purpose of spiritual elders in a community in, let's call in prehistoric or early historic Ireland, let's say before the arrival of Christianity? What is the purpose of the senior elders of a community, the shamans, as it were, or the priests, in communicating these myths to the initiate, as it were, and the younger members of the community? The purpose was to give them a grounding in life and to help them to understand that life ain't easy, buddy. It ain't just all going to be roses. People are chasing this materialistic dream right now in modern life where they think good job equals good salary equals happiness. And we spoke about that again last time, and the can of worms that is. That, well, what is happiness and how do you measure it? And does your salary and your material wealth and the life that you have zipping up and down the motorway stuck in traffic and, presenting this false ego, this mask to your employers or your fellow employees
and
wherever you work. Yeah. And does that make you happy at the end of it all? No. I think the reason that community prevented catastrophe was because there were always those people in a community who could ward it off by various means, and some of those means in traditional cultures were initiation, rites, rituals, etc. And then undoubtedly the mythical, the symbols and the characters and the warriors of myth were all designed to communicate something to us, whether that was to be communicated at a fully conscious level or at a subconscious level. But as you say, a grounding for your life that sets the tone for you, that, you lose your innocence at some stage, and usually in traditional cultures that's at the initiatory stage when some rite is carried out on a youth, maybe a teenager approaching adulthood, where they're taken away from their community and they're brought into the wilderness, and maybe, I think in some traditional African cultures, they're circumcised, etc., etc. That something happens to you there in which you are seen to grown up and you're seen to have returned to your community then as a person with, a certain amount of wisdom and
a man or an adult. You return a man. You
come
leave
of
a boy,
age.
You leave a boy. You come of age, and you return a man. So, is there an Irish version of that? Because I've never heard of one.
Well, I think there is. I think there is. So, for instance, I'll give you an example of what I would call a shamanic myth. And a shaman, in Joseph Campbell's description, is somebody who has... this is a little bit maybe different to an initiation. But just to give you a sort of an example that's on those lines, Campbell spoke about the shaman as being somebody who had a significant breakdown and a cracking up, and then who went away from their community and went off into the wilderness, where basically they encountered themselves in the darkness and, came to terms with their own faults and weaknesses as humans.
Yeah, that dark night of the soul.
Yes, and then returned to their community whole, as it were, that they, in essence, had, through their own suffering, come to heal themselves. And remember, who was it said, only the wounded physician heals? And that applies very much to the traditional shaman. In other words, only someone who's gone through the suffering has the knowledge to heal someone properly. Well, in the myths of Newgrange, there's a story called Ashlinga Aengus. This is the dream of Aengus Og, who took ownership of Brunabónir or Sidan Broga from the Dagda, who was the chief of the gods, the aforementioned sort of solar deity. And Aengus takes ownership of Sidan Broga, and it then becomes known as Brú Mac an Og after Aengus. But Aengus has a dream in which a woman visits him, and he reaches out to her and she disappears. And he has this dream for several nights in a row. The woman appears to him, this beautiful maiden, and she's more beautiful than anything he's ever seen, but she disappears again. Now, of course, in the Jungian analysis, that's his anima, the feminine aspect of himself that is projected into an image of a female that he is attracted to. And he basically starves himself. He won't eat, and he starts to waste away through lovesickness. And so the assistance of his parents, Bowen and Dagda, is sought, and they furthermore seek the assistance of Bob Jarrag, who's one of the Dedanan deities, who actually later became king of the Dedannans. Bub Jarrig is a brother of Dagda. And so he says, look, we will find her. I promise you, don't worry, we'll find her. And eventually they find her. And he says to Aengus, you have to go and see her. She's at a lake called Loch Bael Dracon, which is apparently translated as the Lake of the Dragon's Mouth, which is in modern-day Tipperary, apparently. So he takes him there, but he explains to Aengus that she's a changeling. So for 1 year she's a swan, and for another year she's a human. So on alternate years she's a human, and then on the other year she's a swan. And so he's taken to the lake where she's in the form of a swan, and she's surrounded by thrice 50 or 150 other swans, and Aengus has to pick her out. And Aengus walks to the shore and immediately recognises Care. That's her name. Bub tells Aengus her name is Care. And he's immediately able to pick her out, even though she's in swan form now, and not in the human form that he saw her in his visions. So in doing so, she drifts over to him, and she says that if you want to have my love, you have to take my form. So he changes into a swan. And the story says that they fly from there to Brunabonia, and they put the inhabitants of Brunabonia to sleep with their enchanted singing. They fly around the brew 3 times, and then they fly into it. And presumably they live happily ever after, so the story might go. And I think that's, in essence, the story of the shaman, or the one who has to go through this sort of initiation rite, where in order to live and prosper and rule fully and properly, Aengus Og, as the keeper of the brew, has to encounter this sickness within himself and has to undergo this shamanic experience. And of course, Care takes the form of what you call a psychopomp, which is a guide to the other world, somebody who can change form, and who brings you on this journey into other realms, and that's the only way he can be cured. Now, I'm not sure if the story as we have it now is complete and in its original form, but it certainly has essences of that, and that in essence what happens to Aengus is that he undergoes a sort of a shamanic journey, and that only the wounded physician heals. In other words, the person who wants to come back to their community and to be a healer or to be a leader of any sort, and to have integrity in that role, has to have undergone a certain initiation or a certain suffering themselves, if that makes any sense.
No, it does. I'm lost a little bit at the story of transforming into the swan. If you were to transform into a worm, say, do you know that kind of way, or something that was deemed to be a lowly creature, but like swans are kind of, maybe it's a modern thing, but I presume our ancestors were the same, kept in relatively high esteem because they are intrinsically graceful creatures. So that there's no real darkness there, or is the darkness that you were a man and now you're an animal, or was he even a man? Sorry, was he a deity of sorts?
Well, a deity, I suppose. We don't really know what the Dedannans were in essence, because some scholars would draw attention to the fact that if you think about the Milesians arriving, and the Dedannans going into the mounds, was it that the culture of the Neolithic, the people who built the monuments, that they were replaced by something that came in, a new influx of people with different ideas and maybe different technology, including metal, because the Bronze Age came swiftly after the monuments were built. So were the Dedannans representative of the people, the old people dying out, basically, and that all that was left of them was their spirits in the mounds,
Yeah.
So it's an interesting sort of thought. I think you're right about the bird, the swan in particular, being held in esteem. I think at the end of the story of the Children of Lear, it is said that the Milesians, I think, enlisted protection, and they made a law preventing anybody from harming a swan from that time forth, because of what the Children of Lear, the suffering they had undergone in the form of swans for 900 years,
And the Children of Lear and the Salmon of Knowledge and all the other different bits of mythology that we might have picked up as kids, is there continuity in these stories? Or are they a bit all over the place and not non-related, or is that just the fragmented parts that we have left that we're still trying to kind of piece together?
Well, I think you're right. I think more probably the latter we're still trying to piece together. I mean, I did draw attention earlier to the fact that, the salmon of knowledge was given a name in one of the accounts, and that name was Fintan. And Fintan, as Fintan MacBorcra, had transformed into a salmon to avoid drowning, basically, in the Great Flood, But I think there's a sort of a cosmology there in some of those stories that may be hard to grasp by the modern analytical mind, and that is that man and man in general, I'm talking men and women, people, human beings have always, I think, throughout history identified to some extent with the animal and the natural world. We have a great affinity with creatures and with plants and trees especially, Why would we transform into them? Well, I'm not exactly sure, except for that there is a sort of an animal nature in man, isn't there? That beneath all of the sophisticated exterior and the ego and everything else, we consider ourselves to be, well, I think we recognise within ourselves an animal nature.
Well, we are animals.
Yeah.
We do have a nature.
Yeah. So do we consider ourselves outside of the animal kingdom, above the animal kingdom? I don't know. In prehistory, did we consider ourselves just to be part of it? And did we have a sort of a mutual respect for various creatures? Like, the creatures that you encounter in Irish mythology are diverse, but there's a lot of myths about bovines, cows and bulls, okay? That may well be tied into their value as commodities and money. Your wealth for a long time in Ireland was calculated by how many cattle you owned.
Of course, yeah.
Or how much land you had to graze or to plant your grains on. So as a farmer, your cattle equals wealth. The swan is very significant in Irish myth. In fact, the ethna of that story I spoke about earlier on, the Altram Chia Gaw Weather, she is described in that myth as a swan, which I think is curious. Cuchulain's mother, or Setanta's mother, comes to Newgrange chasing swans from Owen Macha, and that is where Lou comes to Declan, at Newgrange, and tells her she's going to bear a son and his name will be Setanta, and he later becomes Cuchulain. So again, you have Newgrange at the centre of an important myth, and you also have the swan. Other creatures, the salmon, the hawk, to a much lesser extent, occasionally you get cats, bees, dogs, but a huge amount of bovine mythology, and then mythology pertaining to curious creatures that don't have an obvious description. So as, like, for instance, the mata, which was some sort of a great beast, some sort of a giant serpent or worm or monster or dragon or something like that. And the oilfecht, which is a similar creature, which might have been some sort of like a giant worm or something like that. Pigs are very common in Irish myth as well, and in fact the Dedannans are said to have been able to transform themselves into pigs. And indeed, Lou's father Cian, when he's being pursued by the sons of Turin at Moorhevna, which is modern day County Louth, that's the setting for that story, transforms himself into a pig and tries to get lost in a swineherd, but the brothers transform into bloodhounds and sniff him out.
Right.
And they spear him as a pig, but he's wounded, but then he retains his animal form, or his human form, should I say, and then they kill him in human form. And Lou takes a great revenge upon them for this. The sorry story of the sons of Turin, in which they're made to do many great and impossible feats, as it were. They're punished very, very greatly for this murder of a god, by the way, because Cian was one of the Dedannans and Lou Lawfada was his son. So pigs are important. And also at Newgrange, Dagda was said to have kept 2 pigs, one on the spit cooking and one alive ready to be killed. And the story is that basically it didn't matter how many times you killed the live one, there was always still a live one left In other words, there's an inexhaustible supply of food in whatever realm the Danans have entered, which is presumably some sort of immortal or afterlife realm, where you shall not thirst or go hungry, to borrow some biblical or Christian terminology.
Well, we touched on the idea of Ireland being completely covered in forest last time. I think you had a great line that a squirrel could go from Arran Head to Mizzen Point without hitting the ground.
Yeah,
Is that it? Yeah.
Malin Head, to Mizzen Head,
Malin Head to Mizzen Head,
without its feet ever touching the ground.
So presumably that would have been a world of plenty. Say there would have been pigs, deer, like the hunting would have been good.
I'm not sure about when deer were. I have to be careful here, because this is where my own knowledge suffers. I know that cattle were introduced in the Neolithic. The staple diet in the hunter-gatherer age, the pre-Newgrange Mesolithic period, would have been fish largely, so salmon, eel, trout from the rivers, shellfish from the coasts. Hazelnut was a big staple, readily available and very nutritious. In fact, one of the most nutritious foods. Curiously, that's how the salmon of knowledge was said to have been fed, by the hazelnuts, in the well of Segish, that there were 9 magic hazel trees that grew over it, and the nuts would drop into the well and the salmon would eat the nuts and get its knowledge. And so the nuts are associated with knowledge in the mythology, and nutritionists will tell you that hazelnut is one of the most nutritious foods that you can eat. So if you're stuck for food and you can find hazelnuts, they're a very good source of nutrition for you. So there's a physical nutrition, but also in the mythology there's thought to have been some sort of a mental or magical nutrition that was going on as well, So whatever fruits and berries you could pick and whatever you could hunt, not sure about rabbits as well in that period. I just know I remember reading in The Origin of the Irish by J.P. Mallory, who's associated with Queen's University, a very good book about not just the geographical origins and the mythical origins of the Irish, but also the genetic origins of the Irish people. Fascinating book. And I remember reading about the staples of the Mesolithic diet, and I was not astonished, but I was pleasantly surprised that the hazelnut and the salmon were both part of the staple Mesolithic diet, and here they were in this myth that apparently is a medieval myth about Finn catching or eating the salmon of knowledge by the Boyne. But the archaeologists will tell you that the people who came here and first lived in the Boyne when the monuments were being built, or even beforehand, for them the salmon would have been a very good source of food at certain times of the year.
Of course, and practically an inexhaustible source of food to their standard. Obviously not now. Yeah.
So before the medieval weirs were built, were there some sort of earlier weirs made from some sort of willow or wattle or of some kind? And we think that the answer is quite possibly yes, that you had to encourage the salmon to jump. They get tired from the jump and they rest in the pool behind the weir. That's the point of a weir, is that it's a place where you can, the salmon has to be forced to jump. And they will, and I've seen them. I mean, I presume you have.
Maybe I have. I'm a keen fisherman. So
yeah, great. But a lot of your listeners might never have seen salmon jumping weirs, and it's fascinating watching it.
That should be a national pastime. Is it October, November time?
Yeah. Well, I remember seeing them down at Slane now jumping the weir in, I think, late October. I think, as far as I can remember. It was definitely October. It might have been early October. It was sometime in October.
And it's not that hard to predict within reason. I mean, I think is it when the water is high? No, I think it's when the water is. I think when the water has been low continually for a week or two, and then there's a sudden rise.
Because they make a dash for it then.
I think so.
And there are 3 runs. According to, I learned this from reading a book about Newgrange by archaeologist Robert Hensey. There are 3 significant salmon runs in the year. And I think there's a winter run that lasts from about, roughly speaking, Samhain through to Imbolc, which is basically from Halloween through to St. Bridget's Day, covering the period of winter solstice. So that's interesting, that there would have been salmon coming up the Boyne at a time when a lot of people were gathering at Newgrange to celebrate the winter solstice, And then I think there's a spring run and I think there's a summer run. And one of them is to do with, is it yearlings, fish who are basically making their second return up the river.
Right.
I'm not sure what the terminology is. I can't remember offhand now. I was fascinated by that, and the fact that we nearly wiped that out through intensive fishing.
Yeah, absolutely.
That there was a ban on salmon fishing in the Boyne for a while, and now there's a strict catch and return policy. Now, I've spoken to a few anglers along the Boyne, and they maintain, look, it's not what the guys were doing along the river that was causing the problem.
It was out at sea.
It was the big industrial trawlers out at sea that were causing the problem, So something that had been happening for thousands of years almost died out because of our bloody interference, And the mythology suggests that the salmon is a creature that has great knowledge, and that knowledge can be transferred to the eater of the salmon. The story being that, the salmon has a speckled back with the dots on it.
Yes.
And each dot, according to folklore, represents a hazelnut that the salmon has eaten. So the more dots or speckles,
the wiser the salmon.
Yeah, the wiser the salmon,
Can you outlay the story of the salmon of knowledge for people who wouldn't be familiar with it?
It's very simple and very brief, but basically Finnegas, who's a druid, lives by the River Boyne at Fiach's Pool, which has been identified with one of the salmon weirs at Rossnaree, which is on the bend of the Boyne there, sort of as the Boyne turns northward after it passes Newgrange, heading towards Nouth. And that Finn, who's a boy, comes along, Finn McCool, whose name translates, I have this in Island of the Setting Sun, his name translates as, it could translate as Starry Son of the Hazel, which I think is interesting. Mac Cool, the son of the hazel, which is interesting given how the salmon is supposed to have been fed. But the salmon, according to one myth, lives in the Well of Segish, which is identified with Trinity Well in Carbery in County Kildare, which is very, very close to the actual source of the Boyne, and is said to have been the mythical source of the Boyne. The same well we spoke about with Bowen, who approached the well against the wishes of Nectin, her husband.
And when you say well, do you mean a pool or an actual
it's a well.
man-made well?
Well, a man-made, you see, yes, there's a man-made structure there, a stone line structure around it. But was it originally just a natural spring? It probably was,
Of course.
As a lot of wells have been sort of built into something that people can visit and,
and utilise, say.
Yeah.
The spring was always
put
there.
Your bucket down or your ladle or whatever it is and get your water out of, So the salmon was supposed to swim in the well and be nourished from the nuts. And eventually somehow found its way down the river, and Finnegas is fishing and catches the salmon of knowledge, and Finn offers to help him cook it, and he says to Finn, you can cook it, but don't eat it. Under strict orders, you're not to eat it. But what happens is, as he's cooking it, the skin of the fish blisters. It comes up in a big blister, and Finn presses down on the blister with his thumb and burns his thumb, and immediately puts his thumb in his mouth, and thereby gains all the knowledge of the salmon of knowledge. And I think, according to my own memory of it, Finnegas tells him that he can eat the salmon because it's no use to him anymore, and he realises the significance of what's happened, that the boy was fated or destined to get the salmon, and it wasn't for Finnegas himself. And Finnegas, being a wise druid, probably had enough wisdom of his own anyway. Somebody's pointed out, and I think it's quite lovely, the idea of the boy sucking his thumb. That's an image of real innocence, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like you see children of a very young age, toddlers, sucking their thumb,
Yeah, and if you were to see an adult do it, it would be extremely childish.
You would think so, for an adult to suck their thumb is a very unusual thing, But the image thereby presented is of basically the initiate, the one who is going to come to all the knowledge, having been associated with Finnegas, who is obviously the wise elder of the community, the druid and the seer and probably the poet, the one who has all of the mythical knowledge. And it's not, I suppose, with or without the salmon, his encounter with such a being would have brought him great wisdom anyway. But the story is a metaphor for the transformation of the child. That delineation that happens in initiatory rites, or in circumstances that sometimes happen in people's lives, whereby a child suddenly becomes an adult. through various happenings or eventualities or means. Sometimes kids have to grow up very quickly because maybe their father leaves the mother, or there's a domestic abuse going on, or one of the parents dies, or there's a tragedy or something, and the child has to grow up very, very quickly.
Well, I can relate to that. Like my dad died when we would have been all quite young, so there's absolutely you grow up fast, basically, and the same can be said if, let's say, your parents divorce, maybe, or if there's some sort of upheaval in your life as a child. It doesn't have to be a death, say, if there's sickness in your house, or maybe if a sibling is involved in an accident and becomes disabled, or is born disabled, or whatever. But there really is a transformative element to such happenings as a child.
And in the case, for instance, where the father dies, the boy, in some cases, has to become a man very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And has to take on, or doesn't have to, but maybe just feels that they have to. The burden of responsibility is that the father is no longer here, so I have to become the father. And I think that transformation, you see, the thing we want in modern times, we want quick wisdom.
Yeah.
We have, haven't we?
Characters.
We spoke about this the last time. The soundbite and the tweet and the selfie have become symbols of our shallowness in that regard. So I spoke last time about my own journey through depression and anxiety. That I feel that in my own way, I had a shamanistic journey, a shaman's journey, away from my community when I was very depressed, and away. I was only a shadow of myself, but that experience enriched me, and that I have become a much bigger man and a much greater human because of that suffering. And I think today we want just to catch that salmon. So what is the salmon for people today? Let's explore that for a second, because I think that's very interesting. I know a lot of people who are desperate to win the lottery.
Yeah, very much
and
so.
I'm sure you do, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners will.
I would have been one of those people at one stage.
But doing it every week, and they're like, damn, and every time they check the results, there's nothing, or they only won a fiver or whatever. And they think that this catch, if only this salmon of knowledge will land for me, it's going to transform my life and I'm going to be happy. Now, there was a documentary only in the last 2 weeks that I didn't see, but I can only comment on it based on what I've seen online about it, about Irish lottery winners. And the majority of them said that they either ended up no more happy than they were before, or less happy than they had been before they won. Yeah, that should spark something in people to say, let's stop, codding ourselves here.
No, absolutely. And again, I don't know where to credit this from or what the source is, but maybe you've heard it yourself, because it's been out there for a long time.
You're going to butcher another quote here.
I am, a little bit.
Go on, butcher away. I'll help you.
To get my biggest fucking knife here. But basically, the idea is that I think that lottery winners have been studied, essentially, and a year later, they're less happy than amputees are. So people who've, lost limbs, who you might, let's say, lost both their legs, say, you would imagine that person would be infinitely less happy than somebody who at the same time won the lottery. But that's not necessarily so. And in the same way that you had your own kind of dark night of the soul, as I did, we lost a part of ourselves, I think, maybe. Not a physical part like some people lose, obviously, but you burn off certain elements of yourself. Like I lost my sense of self, essentially. I was in a nice big flash car. I was earning big money. I had a company credit card. More money than I could spend. I remember looking back and calculating that I was spending at one point €200 a month on coffee in filling stations. That's what I was, €200 a month on just cups of coffee. And that was nothing too insane. That was, 3 or 4 cups of coffee a day.
Yeah.
But they were €2 or €3 a piece. And over the course of a month, that's what you're talking, at least, like.
Yeah.
And I built up this, I achieved this quite young as well. So I would have been only, 22 2 or 3, and I was in a brand new car, and I had, the credit card, and wearing the suit to work, and the
you had
whole
it
lot.
made.
Like,
You were the
yes,
symbol
sir.
of success.
Yes, that's
you were
it.
the man everybody wanted to be.
That's it. Absolutely.
And how did you feel? Before you had your crash, obviously. How did you think? Looking back now, how do you feel? How do you think you felt then?
At the time, I felt great. I did. At the time, I felt great.
But now
looking back on
with
it,
hindsight,
it was so vacuous.
Yeah,
it was so superficial, so meaningless. There was nothing there. And then you take away the car, take away the phone, take away the wage, and like I was spoken about this on the podcast. I was suicidal. I said goodbye to family and friends, people that I knew at that moment in time. I wouldn't see them, and in my own head, I said, I left people basically saying, that's that. Won't see them again. Had a plan, the whole lot, but so I went from being on top of the world, in inverted commas, being on top of the world, being the guy that everyone wanted to be, in his early 20s with a flash car and the suit and the whole lot, and that the ego was fully inflated. And once that went, I lost my sense of self, essentially, and that resulted in me being suicidal, basically. And I think maybe that collectively we all underwent a little bit of that when the rug was pulled from under the majority of us. Maybe not to the same extent as me or anyone who was in the construction industry, which I think got hit harder than most, maybe. But I think we lost something of ourselves, and I think we've come through that now, maybe, and are possibly the better for it.
Well, I think people who worked in construction were earning a lot of money in the boom, and then suddenly were earning nothing. So it was a big fall.
That was me.
Whereas
in a nutshell.
people in the public service and in the civil service and in private industry were finding that their expenses were being cut, their wages were being cut, but they still had something.
Yes.
Whereas a lot of people in construction just went from boom to bust overnight. So that's very interesting that you should share all that, and I now feel like I'm the one asking the questions and you're in the hot seat. So that's an interesting role reversal that's just taken place there. No, but genuinely, I find, you know what I'm finding very interesting about what we've just been through? We were talking about the shaman, and we were talking about the initiatory rite. We were talking about basically the point that my friend Laura Murphy calls the Setanta point, where Setanta is faced with this great challenge of the hound of Cullen, the smith of the king. His hound, giant hound, is bounding towards the boy, and he's going to get ripped apart by this hound. It's going to destroy him, and he's only one option as far as he's concerned, and that is the only thing he knows how to do is to use a hurl and a sliotar. And he throws the sliotar up and he hurls it, and it enters the dog's mouth in through its body and drags its insides out through its rear end, and he kills the hound. At that point, the smith Cullen is inconsolable. He says, "My hound is dead, what am I going to do?" And Setanta says, "I will become your hound." That's how he gets the name Cú Cullen, the hound of Cullen. And Laura calls this Setanta point, which is a point that we reach in life, whether we reach it through the initiatory rites of a traditional community, or we reach it through crisis, where the boy has to become a man. So if I can just analyse for a second what you just told me, and you've just shared something that's very personal and very brave of you to share it. I was never suicidal. I was very badly depressed, but I was never suicidal. I knew I would never take my own life. So you're the symbol of the boy living as a man, with the flash car and drinking the coffees and living the high life, probably, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
To me, mythically, that is the image of the boy that hasn't yet been initiated and hasn't grown up.
Absolutely.
Now, your experience was very dramatic and profound, but like we said the last time, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Right? So in essence, you've undergone that initiation, but it hasn't been an initiation through choice or through... It's not something you would have thought of. I think in order to grow up, I need there to be an economic collapse to bring me to my senses and for me to become suicidal to then grow from that experience. But in essence, that's what's happened. And look at what you're doing now. What you're doing now is you're trying to serve your community with this podcast, because I know I've listened to you, what you told me about it personally, what we've spoken about on air, and then listening to other podcasts. You have a desire now to help people and help society. So in essence, your experience has helped you to grow as a human being. You've grown up very significantly from all of that. And you would never be able to become the boy again. That's the point about the Satanta point and the salmon of knowledge point. You can't go back. It's not something you can go back to. It is like after the hobbits make that perilous journey into Mordor. They can never go back to Hobbiton and the Shire and have the same innocent existence they had previously. They've been initiated into something, into a role of a much, I wouldn't call it severe, but a much greater and elevated and a role full of responsibility, but which they appear to grasp almost enthusiastically,
Yeah, yeah.
So in going to the brink and in staring into the abyss, you've come back. To me, that is mythical. That is the essence of some of these great myths.
And
the hero,
I couldn't agree with.
You're a hero for yourself, You've made a heroic journey. You have. You've faced all of your darknesses to the point of suicide, to the point of ending it all, and you've come back from that. I don't think anybody could be stronger than the person who's come back from that sort of experience.
Well, I wonder, would that experience been not easier, but I don't think anybody should have to go to those kind of depths.
No, you shouldn't have to.
But is that the idea of the initiation?
Yeah.
That you don't get pushed quite that far, but let's say, I don't know, 3/4 of the way there, say, so that when you do have an economic collapse and you do lose your sense of self, that you don't end up so far down that dark road.
Correct.
Is that why the suicide rates are off the charts these days, because we don't have that initiation, we don't have that mythology?
I think that's part of it. And
of course, there's no.
Look, a lot of people are going to be listening to this, and they're going to be agreeing with some of what we say, and they're going to be disagreeing. That's fine. That's what we're here to do, to provoke debate, isn't it?
Absolutely.
But in essence, I think you're right. We spoke last time about the fact that we lack a mythical grounding as a people and as a society. And I said last time a lot of people would find that idea ridiculous and even nauseating. Why would we be grounded in our myths? The thing about the traditional culture and the traditional role of a druid or a priest or a shaman was precisely that, was to ground you, was to help you as a human to understand and to realise that, as I said, life isn't going to be all rosy. And it's not about making life seem it's going to be a constant challenge either. But I think if you're mythically grounded and you're grounded in a sort of a community where there are these initiatory rites, you're less likely to meet that crisis and to not be able to deal with it. I think that's the point.
Yeah, no, absolutely, because you're going to meet crisis. It's coming.
Yeah.
But to be prepared for it.
Yeah. So what is, to take some Irish examples, what is the voyage of Bran, for instance? What is, in which he visits all these magical islands and encounters all sorts of weird, wonderful creatures. What is the slaying of the Mata in the Boyne by the men of Ireland at Lech Ben at Brunabonia? What is that about?
And sorry, remind me what the Mata was again?
Well, the Mata was this monster that was dismembered, that had licked up the Boyne. The big beast, this almost like a dragon-like, serpent-like thing. And it was killed. Well, what is that except for that meeting of these great life forces that we encounter and being able to meet them, the slaying of the dragon, as it were, or the pulling of the sword from the stone, the Arthurian myth, which is reflected in the Irish folk tale relating to the sleeping armies. Like, for instance, there's a story at Rossnaree, which is in my new book, Mythical Ireland, and there's a story at Garrett's Fort near Ardee, which is in Island of the Setting Sun, which talks about a cave beneath a ring fort, where a man goes in to enter and he sees a sword in the wall, and he pulls the sword from the wall, and as he does, this phantom army rouses from their sleep. And he basically hasn't got the courage to pull the sword completely from the wall and flees from the place. And they shout after him that he's a coward, you know. The idea is that you're rousing this sleeping army. We encounter this in Lord of the Rings, where Aragorn walks the paths of the dead, and it's beautifully done in the movie, where he wields the sword against the dead army. And he actually, it's not that he overpowers them, he takes them under his command, and he uses them then in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. And that is a mythical image of us being brave enough to overcome that fear. And that is something that so referring back to something I said earlier in the interview, I spoke about how the meaning of a myth can percolate without you necessarily coming to a substantial conscious realization of its meaning.
Yes.
So in other words, it's percolating. Something clicks with you subconsciously or unconsciously, where you recognize somewhere deep within you, you recognize that this is a metaphor for, you know, this encounter that might happen to me in my life, etc., etc. The person who allegedly enters the cave, Joseph Campbell, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek, is widely attributed to Joseph Campbell. Now, I went in search of that quote from my book Mythical Ireland, and I can't find it in his written works, but it ties in very closely with things that he did say, and he is likely to have said it probably in an interview. The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. So the idea of Garrett's fort is that the guy is going in to pull the sword from the wall, like Arthur pulling Excalibur from the stone, except for the guy pulls it out so far, and this phantom army becomes awakened in the darkness, and he flees in terror from this. That is the idea, I think, the universal notion of confronting your fears and those things with which you think you would flee from, but which you may have to actually confront fully and immersively in your human existence.
There's an element of purposefully heading towards the cave in search of the dragon as well, as opposed to waiting for the dragon to come to you, isn't there?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. What is the cave? Well, the cave to me is a metaphor for darkness. And what does darkness represent? Well, some people say bad or evil or whatever, but that shadow nature of yourself. So what are you fearing to confront is something within your own nature that you haven't recognized. And if you haven't recognized that it's there, what happens is you end up projecting it onto others, which, by the way, is one of the sicknesses that plagues modern Western society. So I'll give you an example of that, just so your listeners can keep up with me if they're finding difficulty with it. In the United States of America right now, the darkness of the European white man, we're mostly talking about European settlers in the States, white Europeans, people who can trace their ancestry back to Europe, whether it be Ireland or Italy or Germany or wherever.
Yeah.
Unable to confront that shadow within themselves, have projected it onto minorities and people of different skin colour and people of different religious beliefs. So the Muslim community, for instance, is having a hard time. I think they're having a hard time in parts of Europe, obviously. But we're just talking about the States for now, because I want to talk about the symbol of this. The symbol is the one thing. So in everything that's happened in America over the past few years, over the last number of years, all of the major sort of attacks and shootings, mass shootings, etc. The one that instantly provokes a reaction towards minorities is when a Muslim terrorist is involved. But the one that provokes the least reaction from the establishment is the white man with the gun.
Yeah, very much so.
And the white man with the gun, the reason for that is because that is the projection of the darkness that is within the white man. The projected image is the white man with the gun is something that we cannot recognise within ourselves. So therefore we can't deal with it, and we won't deal with it. So where shootings have been carried out by white males, Las Vegas for instance, there's almost a denial. It's no, we haven't got all the facts, etc., etc. But if it's a Muslim who does something in New York, maybe drives a truck into a crowd or shoots some people or whatever, there's an immediate rush to judgment, and there's an immediate close the borders and build the walls and stop planes coming from these Muslim nations.
Yeah, when it's a white American, it sparks the gun control debate. But when it's a brown Muslim, say, it's the close the borders, kick out the illegals debate.
Yeah, well, I think that's it. So the one image that America cannot and won't deal with is the image of the white man with the gun. It is the one that provokes an almost blank reaction from the establishment. Thoughts and prayers. And you've seen all the memes, I'm sure, on social media about how useless thoughts and prayers are in this whole thing, and that we're just going to see tragedy after tragedy after tragedy until the white American man recognises within his own shadow that murderous figure with the gun and realises that that is something that is within me. And when I realise that, then I can do something about it.
That we're all capable of it.
But in the meantime, the only people who are causing problems are the Muslims and the Mexicans and
the other
African people of African American origin, etc., etc. The minorities and the ones who have trouble sticking up for themselves because they encounter this prejudice. And that prejudice stems from, okay, we're going into psychology here rather than mythology. But I just think that it's fascinating that the white man with the gun is the one symbol of almost everything that is wrong with America right now. But it is the one symbol that America can't and won't confront, because there's a recognition there on a very deep subconscious or unconscious level that is me.
No, absolutely. And there's a guy I've mentioned a couple of times in the podcast that I'd be a big fan of. I'd be surprised if you're not familiar with him. Jordan Peterson. I don't know, are you familiar with him at all?
I've heard the name.
Yeah, you should definitely go down a Jordan Peterson shaped rabbit hole. But he speaks a lot of how the Nazis weren't these evil race of people. They were people just like me and you. And that evilness is within us all, and that you have to confront that and be aware of that in order to, I suppose, understand yourself.
Yeah. And in Nazi Germany, they projected all of the badness onto the Jews.
Yes, the
Jews were responsible for everything that was wrong. And all of those things persist to these days. The amount of propaganda that you encounter online about the Jews running America and running the Western world, and
controlling banking and all this shit.
All that paranoid stuff. It's like, well, they're doing well for a race and a nation of people that were nearly wiped off the face of the planet,
Literally, yeah.
What do we do? Okay, it's not for us to do it. I'm worried, and the reason I'm worried, as I said in the last interview, is because I think I see shades of all of those mass psychoses that have happened in the past, like Nazi Germany, in what's happening in America right now. And I worry because this isn't something that's just happening over there. Because if something major happens there, it can affect the whole world economy. And our economy is founded on foundations of sand, really, when you think about it.
Oh, very much so.
Like, if we encountered the modern equivalent of the Wall Street crash of, was it the 1930s? I think that's the sort of thing that could bring us to some sort of great destructive human event. I think likewise a terrorist attack on a large enough scale on an American city could bring us to a similar situation, because what's going to happen is there's just going to be a lash out of anger, because What people don't realise is that this symbol of the white man with the gun is actually a symbol of anger that stems up from the deepest part of our own resentment. But it's not actually derived entirely from our resentment of other people of other races and skin colour. It's actually just mostly derived from our abhorrence of our own dark nature.
Absolutely, and again, this idea of the other, we can see it in those. And again, another biblical quote that I might get thereabouts right. We can see the splinter in someone else's eye, but not the plank in our own.
Yeah.
And that's why I think racism really exists. It's because you can spot them in a crowd, that they really are the other, because you can make a difference. And you see that in nature. Like there's a common misconception that, let's say, lions target the weak and the elderly, and
they not target the fattest people with the most meat on them. No,
they don't. Do you know what? Do you know what animal predators like? The big cats. Do you know what they look for? Something that's identifiable, something they can pick out. So they go for the guy with the limp, not because they're easier to catch, but because they can navigate their hunt around this one thing.
That makes a certain amount of sense.
And I think it might have been, I don't know if it was Robert Sapolsky discovered this, but I think, let's say some scientists, it mightn't have been Sapolsky, but some scientists I think was studying zebras properly for the first time. I think it could have been Sapolsky. He's a behavioural psychologist, or behavioural scientist. And what he noticed was he'd be sitting out in the savannah and he'd be taking notes on this herd of zebras. And he'd look down at his notebook and take notes, and look back up and go, fuck, which zebra was I looking at? So he put a dab of dye on the zebra's haunch. And what happened? The lions immediately murdered all of the ones that were marked because they could identify them.
Okay, yeah.
And if you look, and we're animals, we're predators, we're group hunters. So if we can differentiate somebody by an identifiable thing, like the colour of their skin, say, or their curly hair, or their flatter nose, or whatever it is, it just makes that bit easier to kind of demonise them.
Yeah. Yes. In some way that marks them out from us, that they're different.
They're different.
Yeah,
of course. Well, that's it.
That's the basis of all racism, really, isn't it? And all xenophobia.
Of course.
Is that people are different in some way. With the Jews, it was just that they believed themselves to be a separate, religiously blessed group of people, and that blessing turned out to be largely a curse for them to some degree. I don't want to turn this into a facile debate, because I don't want people to think that I'm just throwing out sound bites. Yeah, that's from Matthew, I think. Why dost thou behold the mote that is in thine brother's eye, when there is a plank in thine own eye? First, remove the plank from your eye, and then point out the minor flaw in your brother's eye. You know? Judge not that thou be not judged. Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. For with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged, and with what measure ye mete, it shall be measured unto you again. That, to me, should be the central message of Christian religion. But it is, but not in the case, not in the circumstance that I meant it. In other words, what's been clearly intimated is that you shouldn't look for faults in others. You should see your faults in you first, which is a central message of the whole Jungian thing of looking at your shadow. Christianity turned that into sin. So there's original sin. So even if you're never committed a crime in your life, or you've never broken one of the commandments, you have something called original sin that you're born with. So you're a flawed human being in the Christian analysis.
Yes.
From day one. But the problem is that Christianity just wants you to repent for that, and to constantly try and... It wants you to focus on that all the time. Whereas Jung wants you to see, I think, now this is from my reading of it, and I'm no Jung expert, Jung wants you to understand that that's there within you, but that it is not an essential essence of who you are. That you cannot banish it completely, but nor should you deny it.
Yes.
And actually denial is the greatest sin of a human, because to deny your own dark nature is to go down this, I think, neurotic and psychotic path towards xenophobia and towards harming other people because you refuse to recognize that there might be something in your own nature that causes you to do that. Judge not that thou be not judged. So you shouldn't judge others. You need to look inwards first. But yet, doesn't the whole... For me, anyway, look, I have to be careful again. I don't want to... We didn't come back here to start bashing religion again. But just to say that for me, Christianity hinges around the idea of judgment. Somebody said to me once, no, it's not about judgment, it's about forgiveness. And I said, but sure, you have to judge somebody to have done something wrong before you can forgive them. Sure, what are you forgiving them for them if you haven't judged them of doing something?
Of course.
And the most fearsome symbol of judgment is this fiery hell that is threatened with us. You know, oh yea, the wicked shall burn as the stubble, according to the book of, not Daniel, Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament. And the wicked shall burn as the stubble. You know, and almost celebrating the idea that people who are deemed to be bad will suffer, and suffer greatly. Well, what if that suffering isn't so much the suffering of a calamity brought on by your fellow humans, but your own suffering that brings you to realization of God, whatever that God may mean to you? I'm not talking about the fearsome God of the Old Testament. I'm just talking about that God nature that your own experience brings you closer to. I would much prefer to identify with the stories of shamanic journeying from the ancient myths than to identify with a lot of what is in the Bible, because I read a lot of it and I studied it in desperation to try and cling on to it. And I realised that it was never going to serve me, because I think organised religion in general serves those who lead it.
Yes, of course.
Much more so than the people who they claim to be shepherding to some great afterlife existence, you know. And that's a cynical way of looking at it. I know it is, and I apologise for that, but that's just... But the one thing I didn't do was to turn to atheism as a resort to that. But your own story just brought all that to mind, that, you know, sometimes the suffering is something that you encounter totally unexpectedly. It is not of your own making. Circumstances overtake you. Something happens to you in your life that changes things drastically and permanently. And as I said, you reach the Setanta point, and after which there is no going back, because you've gone beyond losing your innocence.
Yeah, there's a transformation there. You are now something entirely different.
Yeah, but hopefully something that has grown.
Oh, something better,
bigger
absolutely.
and better and more wholesome and more human.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and you've cried out in the darkness and your voice has been heard, even if it's only by yourself.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in Irish mythology, just you mentioned there the idea of kind of heaven and hell in Christianity, say. Was there an equivalent heaven and hell in Irish mythology?
I'm trying to think about an idea of hell. I'm scrambling in my head while you're asking me that. Because there are many heavens.
Okay.
There are many very pleasant lands and realms and places. So, for instance, Manannán's home is Owen Ablach, which some historians try to identify with one of the islands off Scotland, because Alba is Scotland, you know. But it's actually an imaginary place. The land of promise, Tir Tarngre, Tir na Meo, the land of the living or the ever-living, Tir na Nog, the land of the youth. You know, I mean, the She itself to me is representative of an entrance to eternity, you know. And that's what it really represents to me at its fundamental level.
So any of the mounds that are around the country, up to and including Newgrange and Howth and Doubt and etc., they're all portals essentially to the afterlife or to
but
another dimension.
I think even beyond that, the idea or the fundamental notion of a She is the ability to transfer or to transmute or to transport between realms, if you understand. In other words, isn't it entirely possible for us as meditative human beings to enter a state of nirvana or bliss in our own existences on occasion, just by doing a simple thing like maybe sitting and meditating? Or, as I said to you last time, you know, I find sometimes I enter eternity on a thought. You know, just being close to nature, or being by the river, or hearing the sound of the waves crashing into the shore, or being on some hilltop or mountaintop and feeling that you've been elevated from ordinary human existence into some, you know, super ordinary plane, or some, you know, overarching divine realm or something. I don't know. These are the nuministic experiences that I spoke about earlier that we seek as part of our mythical and religious life, our spiritual existence, that are there for us to experience. But it's not necessarily the traditional image of happy people sitting on thrones with fountains around them, you know, and fluffy clouds.
Yeah.
You know, that is almost like a stereotypical image, you know. It's not the stereotypical image. It's the idea of, well, can you enter your own heavenly state, you know, just by entering a particular meditative or trance state yourself? Okay, some people take some sort of a drug or a hallucinogen, and other people smoke weed, and, you know, some people get drunk and then they think they're happy. But I think, you know, I'm talking about sort of like a genuine experience of, and I think I've experienced that, you know, and I think I've been more inclined to experience it following my suffering, that I've been able to experience these divine moments where I feel like I could possibly live forever. Stuff that I've actually written about, you know. You could enter heaven on the basis of a tiny little thought that, for instance, I am an eternal being. I'll never live I'll never live the same life again, but I'll never die fully. Or it's just when you open your mind to the possibilities, and you suddenly become a Fintan MacBorcra.
Have you yourself a concretized version of that? Do you believe in an afterlife, say, as such? Or and sorry, before I actually forget, the whole mythology that you've been, I don't know if infatuated is the right word, but that this rabbit hole that you've gone down, is that, it strikes me as being a very spiritual journey for you personally.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously, says you.
Well, you see, the whole discussion really for tonight has kind of... Well, we wanted to talk about mythology, because you said that we didn't really talk about much mythology the last time.
Yes.
We talked a lot of ologies. But, you know, I think it should be obvious from my work. Now, fair enough, you haven't maybe read my work, but it should be obvious that, yes, mythology has been a spiritual experience for me. It's impossible for me to see it from the mindset of an analytical and atheistic perspective. To me, immersion in mythology is itself a nuministic or a transcendent experience.
Yeah, you lose all the nuance when you try and set it down to dates and timelines and all the rest of it.
No, look, some of it is head melting. Trying to work out what some of it means is head melting, so you have to leave it. I find intuitively now, much more so than even 10 years ago, when I read a myth, I find the meaning of it percolating or coming to the fore very quickly for me, compared to years ago when I'd read a myth and I wouldn't have a clue what it meant.
Yeah.
You know, I think you just kind of get in tune with that intuitive side of your nature, which I think I've always had anyway. So my first experience of numinism, as it were, the idea of maybe transcending human life and entering some sort of a divine state, was as a child looking at the dark skies when we were brought to Mayo. And I remember we stayed in a house out by, I think, Loch Cara, which is incidentally where St. Patrick tossed the serpent from Croagh Patrick, and that could be a remnant of some sort of an origin myth. But I remember walking out into the garden that night, and I had never seen so many stars, because I'd been grown up in Drogheda, where the streetlights were always a hindrance to seeing the Milky Way and the stars as they were. And out in the west and out in parts of Connemara and down in the Ring of Kerry and in different parts of Ireland, you get to see the stars as your ancients saw them, in all their magnificent glory. And I remember after that coming back to Drogheda and occasionally staying out at night with friends and looking up at the stars and telling them about the constellations and some of the stories relating to the constellations, and just feeling that I, in doing that, was reliving countless lives. An intuitive feeling that I was just doing something that ancestors had done time and again for aeons of time into the past. And that made me feel magnificent.
I'd say so.
Yeah, it did. And so that was my first proper transcendent experience. Much more so than anything I encountered going to church. Going to Mass. Mass never made sense to me. It never made sense why you would sit in an uncomfortable chair mumbling prayers repeatedly, and and all this stuff that was going on in the altar, cracking of bread and drinking of wine.
Well, listen, you're preaching to the converted.
No, and look, we're not going down that. I know we're not opening up that can of worms, but much more so than that, the magical experience were, for me, some of the most wonderful experiences of my life have been the simplest. Yeah, watching the stars was one of them. So, from a young age, I was interested in the science of astronomy. A lot of people used to say, "You're an astrologer, aren't you?" I said, "No, I'm an astronomer." What's the difference? Well, an astrologer tells you that you're going to, encounter new love this week because the moon is in Pisces.
Yes.
I'm telling you that I'm interested in the fact that we're 93 million miles from the sun and that the nearest star is 4 light years away. What does that mean? Light year is a measure of distance, not time. The light from that star left it 4 years ago. See that, the Andromeda galaxy up there? See that faint patch of light? Well, that's 2.2 million light years away. Do you know what that means? What you're seeing now is 2.2 million years old. We were gorillas when that light left that. It's mind-blowing, factual
insane
stuff.
Yeah.
But at the back of it, an intuitive, overwhelming, awesome feeling of connectivity with my cosmos, with a feeling of oneness and a feeling of connection with history and ancestors, and a real uplifting thing that you can't even explain what's going on in you, except for that you just feel tremendously uplifted by the experience of just watching those stars.
Yeah, it's kind of a oneness with the universe, really, isn't it?
It's tremendous. That's what I'm talking about. That experience of heaven that people bypass because they're so busy looking for, that salmon of knowledge that we call the lottery win. They land the salmon and they cook the salmon and they eat it. Everything will be right. No. Because you have to come to the experience of the divine and the eternal, not through necessarily means of your own design. So you can plan and plot all you want for the ideal life. The ideal life begins when you live mythically. As Joseph Campbell would have said, follow your bliss, which is what he maintained. A lot of mythology was about the hero of 1,000 faces, and the hero's journey was all about you, not just confronting your shadow in the Jungian analysis, but you following your path, and your path being one that would bring you happiness, fulfillment, doing what you were created to do. So every human has a calling. But your greatest aim and goal in life, according to Campbell, is to find out what that is and live that life. And then you'll enter heaven.
Yeah, your own personal heaven.
Yeah, that's not to say you won't encounter difficulties and tragedy in your life. Of course, you have to be prepared for that.
Well, they're kind of guarantees, though, aren't they?
Yeah.
Because if you
can't escape that.
If you haven't been sick, your wife or son or daughter or mother, they're going to get sick. And if you haven't had a death in your family, that's coming. do you know that kind of way? Like, and if you haven't had your existence rocked, watch out, because that's coming too.
But a great deal of people, and this is one of the things I really love about Joseph Campbell, was because he was such an academic. He, in the aforementioned Great Depression, he went off and spent 5 years locked in a shed reading about mythology from all around the world, and became hugely knowledgeable. But despite the fact that he was an academic, and he was a university professor, first and foremost, he was a teacher, a philosopher, and kind of like a druid, in a way. Campbell was he was able to, as I said the last time, I think, translate the language of Jung, which appeared to be a little bit sort of aloof and complex, into sort of more easily digestible and ready to understand, ideas. But at the core of Campbell's work was the idea of following your bliss. So I would speculate that your bliss was probably, what are you doing in your spare time, to that makes you happy, and you're not actually making any money from it. You're doing the Off the Lead podcast.
Yes.
To me, that I would probably see that as something that you, if you were doing it as a vocation or a profession, would bring you great happiness.
Oh, absolutely.
So that you would never feel like you're working.
Yeah. Oh no, none of this ever feels like work, ever.
So I've invested 20 years of my life into the Mythical Ireland project, and I'm still working a day job as a graphic designer and a sub-editor in a newspaper. I just haven't broken through yet,
Yet being the operative word.
Oh, of course, and I fully intend to. If it's meant to be, it's meant to be. But all I know is I'm following my passions. I'm following those things that make me feel most alive as a human being. And they are what makes me want to keep going, and they are what gives me hope. Because I think if you're deprived of that goal or that existence, then you're just living a sort of a shadow existence or a shell existence, You're just the shell of what you should be. And that is, along with Jung's wish for people to acknowledge the existence of their shadow, is Campbell's wish for people to follow their bliss. And that's all mythically grounded. Campbell's whole life's work was about trying to bring people to the realization that myth performs extremely important functions.
No, absolutely. And you mentioned that Campbell spent so many years learning not about just his own native mythology. He was, English? Campbell?
American.
So there wasn't really an American mythology, say. But have you spent much time looking into the Aztec mythology and, the mythology from around the world, or has it all been Irish?
Not so much. That is sometimes a source of regret to me, where I'm not able to do the comparative stuff. Because comparative mythology is very important. I think it's hampered me in some respects, but I think it's also helped me in others.
Yes.
So you can dissolve or resolve, should I say. Resolve is a better word. Dissolve, not dissolve, resolve. Some of the meanings of an indigenous Irish myth through, your own study of the monuments and the landscape and the mythology and some of the history of the island, etc., etc. However, you cannot resolve all of it without doing the comparative work. Now, I've done a limited amount of that. But you see, the thing is, because it's only a hobby per se, yet, it will be a profession soon. Just to state that. Follow my bliss. Because it's only, I'm trying to fit it all in.
Of course, yeah.
Around
There's only so many
else.
hours in the day.
Correct. So, Irish mythology is so vast that to try and fit in world mythology as well, you'd need a few lifetimes,
Of course.
You really would.
Yeah.
So,
but what I'd love to see is you sit down with your, Dutch counterpart or New Zealand counterpart and basically hash it out. That kind of
do you know where I'd
like
like to start?
Yeah, where
Spain.
would it be? Really?
Yeah, because of the Milesians.
Of course.
Because we've got sort of a common interest there, But
Yeah,
I just think it'd be a good starting point,
And is there a Spanish equivalent to yourself that you're aware of?
I believe there is, but I haven't done a huge amount of investigation about it. That the story of the Milesian departure from Spain is there in Spain, So I'm just interested in following those threads down the line if I get the chance,
But there's no one Spanish guy that you can name who has,
No.
mythical Spain.
No, there isn't. Yeah, no, that's actually a very good question. No, there isn't. Not to my knowledge. I mean, there's probably somebody there, all right.
Well, Graham Hancock would be the English version of you. Would you like?
Well,
are
that's
you the
very
Irish
complimentary of you. If I thought I was at that level, I tell you.
Well, put it this way: even without you, let's say for argument's
How
sake, you're not at
egotistical
that.
of me.
Well, let's say for argument's sake, you're not at the same level as Graham Hancock.
Which I'm not, yeah.
Okay, but are you still the Irish Graham Hancock?
Look, yeah, it's very hard.
And
I will never be the determinant of that. Other people will decide what I am. I'm just doing what I do.
Yes,
I'm not trying to do.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah, so it's not for me to determine whether I am or I'm not. Some people think Hancock is, as we said the last time, some people don't like him, and some people think he's a little bit out there. I largely like him, man. And as I said, it's very important that you can read somebody's work critically. So you can admire parts of it and you can criticise and dislike parts of it. That's perfectly okay.
Yeah.
Sure, what's wrong with that? You can still be a fan, but a fan is not necessarily the one who stands up at the end of his talk and says, "You're wonderful." The fan will sometimes be the one, "Mr. Hancock, that's very interesting, and I'm very glad you brought this to our attention, but can I just tackle you on this because I don't agree with you, and here's my hypothesis on what you said, and blah, blah, blah," and you can be gentlemen and agree to disagree. That's proper debate, isn't it?
No, absolutely.
Which is what's missing, by the way, from politics, especially in the States at the moment. People are just mudslinging from one side to the other, you know?
On the left and the right that's in the States, we don't really have so much of that here.
Oh,
have you thoughts on? Do we is there a left and a right party here?
Well, no. I think you see the point is that the two biggest parties are both right. So the two parties that we mentioned earlier that have been sort of controlling or in control of the Irish government since the foundation of the state are both sort of what you'd call
conservative,
right-leaning conservative parties. Yeah. So it's not just quite.
Have we a left-leaning party?
Well, we had, at one time, the Labour Party was quite a socialist party, but I think they swung more to the centre and more to the right over time. And then I think the vacuum there was filled by Sinn Féin, who sort of, in essence, became the party of the left, you know, almost by default.
Sinn Féin?
Yeah, not...
Of course, yeah, I know what you mean.
Not just because of their own policies, but because Labour helped them into that position, I think. We didn't come here to talk about politics. Please don't go down that rabbit hole.
But I think that there's something like here's one for you. The two things that people say you shouldn't talk about are religion and politics, or spirituality and politics.
Spend a lot of time talking about religion, certainly.
But as far as I'm concerned, they're practically the only two things worth talking about. You know, how we conduct our lives, our morality and our ethics, and how our society is governed. I mean, what could possibly be more important than those two topics? And
astronomy.
Sorry?
Astronomy.
Well,
I think it's much more important than politics, personally speaking.
You seem genuine when you say that, though. I mean, what has astronomy got to do? Like, listen, I'm a big astronomy fan. I'm out for all the meteor showers and all the rest of it. I love it, and I could talk to you about astronomy all day and night.
Can I tell you, very straight?
Go for it.
As honestly as I can.
Yeah, by all means.
I see politics as tedium. I see it as tedious. I have long been concerned with the big questions in life.
But that's what politics should be.
Well, maybe.
About.
And maybe I shouldn't diminish it so readily, because it is important. And, of course, for a society to thrive, it has to have a political discourse. It's just I find myself drawn towards the bigger mysteries of life, and which is why I think myths and ancient monuments and anthropology and cosmology have such a huge interest for me, because they all concern, I think they're all concerned with our deeper human experience, whereas politics can be to an extent seen as, you know, people on different sides of the room chucking mud at each other. Some of it's sticking, some of it isn't.
I think we're there's a cross wire here, because when I'm talking about politics, I'm not talking about, you know, parties. Say I genuinely couldn't tell you who's in power in Ireland. I genuinely couldn't. A hand on my heart, I genuinely do not know who's in power.
Well, it's Fine Gael plus a coterie of smaller groupings of individuals.
I've little to no interest in any of that.
Sorry, I thought you meant party politics.
No, not at all.
Okay, I should allow you the chance to ask the question before.
No, you're right. I can see how anyone would take that. But what I'm more interested in is the liberal aspect of our being and the conservative aspect of our being, because we all have, you know, liberal and conservative kind of tendencies, and without understanding, you know, who we are as a species. And this is why I think you love Jordan Peterson, because he's a clinical psychologist who specialized in personality, and he is, I don't know if he's pioneered the 5 personality traits that we all have, namely being neuroticism, which is your sensitivity to negative emotion, openness, your almost self-explanatory. You're willing to share. I'd be a very open person. I tell you what I had for breakfast and everything in between. So that's neuroticism, openness. Jesus, 2 of the 5. Neuroticism, openness. I'm putting a lovely blank here now. Neuroticism, openness, agreeableness, which is basically how agreeable or disagreeable you are, and I won't even try and think of the other 2. They're there somewhere. But the idea being that we're all more or less of these big 5 personality traits, and depending on which way you lean, that will guide in your political belief. Forget about parties, but it'll make you more progressive or more conservative. And just in relation to anthropology, there's the anthropological explanation for that left-right nature that we have, this progressiveness and conservative nature is. I'm going to butcher this now, but again, the sentiment will be there. We're omnivores, so when we essentially came down from the trees and the climate changed and the land shifted and we had to go about our daily lives in different terrain under different conditions, we had to basically find out new food sources in order for the species to survive over long periods of time. So you needed progressive people to go, ooh, what's that? I'll have a little bit of that. But not everybody could be that way, because if everyone was that way, then everyone might eat the same thing, which was poisonous, and over time essentially kill you off or maybe make you sterile. It might be something that you're eating that could have a detrimental effect on you over long periods of time. So you need progressives out there trying new things, but you also need conservatives who will basically say, "Oh, never ate that before, not eating that," and that's the politics that I'm talking about. Is how we view the world, basically. If all or any of that made sense.
Yeah, just not sure what the question was.
I don't know if there was a question.
Oh, okay, that's okay. That's all right. I am interested in that. I'm sorry for how it's kind of playing out now, in terms of the dichotomy that exists, and it's very evident in the whole Brexit debate and in the rise of Donald Trump in the States, that it seems to be you're either hardline one side or hardline the other side, and never the twain shall meet. Whereas I think probably the greatest breakthroughs in human history have come where we've been, yes, as you say, progressive and exploratory and all the rest, but we also have to have, don't we, to advance a nature that's conducive to openness or changing its mind, as it were, being led by, not by pure emotion, but being driven by, a mixture of things, following facts and also being open to intuition, etc., etc. I think that probably politics and psychology are two things that are very closely intertwined. In my own case, by the way, just for the record, I would say I'm a bit of a liberal.
Right.
So some people would say libtard. Speaking of dichotomy and the opposites and never the twain. So I'd be reasonably liberal, I think, especially on my social views, and economically then maybe a little bit conservative.
But I think that's key. You have to be a bit of both, because there is no right. If you're too left, it goes bad. If you're too right, it goes bad. You need to be somewhere in the middle, because sometimes the conservative viewpoint is the right viewpoint, and sometimes the conservative viewpoint is the right viewpoint. It's the correct viewpoint, say.
I think there's just far too much of this them and us thing, and you're either one or you're the other, you know. It's like, well, that's a dangerous place to be, I think, you know. It's a bit like after 9/11, George W. Bush said, you're either with us or you're against us.
Yes, again,
like,
the other.
There was no third option.
Yes.
Which a lot of countries probably fit into, or felt they fit into, which was, no, actually, we're neither. We definitely don't want to see you undergoing these mass attacks and suffering and all the rest. But at the same time, we're not going to beat your war drum for you, you know, that kind of way, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think the point is that I'm a liberal, but I'm also a moderate. So I'm the sort of person I step back from vicious and vitriolic debate online. Once people start throwing insults, I just leave the room.
Oh no, absolutely. It's degenerated to nothing at that stage.
There was a time when, maybe when I was a bit more rash and a little bit less mature, when I would have maybe added to the insults. But now I just can't stand it. I just think that it degenerates. You only just look. You have a YouTube channel. Look at my videos. There's derogatory comments, and then I don't feed the fish.
I'd never read the comments.
No, I do occasionally. And I like to respond to the ones where people ask me questions, you know, especially if they're interesting, and if the person's genuinely interested in the subject matter.
Well, they're your own videos, so you can, you know, read your own comments.
The amount of YouTube videos where it just entirely enters a juvenile realm of debate, where it just instantly almost turns into a slanging match, and expletives are used, and you're this and you're that and you're a gobshite and you're this, that and the other. And I think that's one of the great difficulties about politics. And the only thing is, I can't tie this into mythology, I don't think. Who are the mediators in mythology? You know, okay, the Milesians and the Danans kind of come to an agreement. I think that is at the instigation of Amergin, who's sort of the spiritual figurehead of the Milesians. Ironically enough, not the political figurehead, because the political figureheads are Eramon and Eberfin, and they actually take joint control of Ireland after the Milesians, or after the Danans give them Ireland. But after the end of a year, they have a fight, and Eramon kills his brother, because, you know, his brother has a bit of an uprising and kind of gets a bit uppity about the situation, you know. And so that's kind of the same thing, really, isn't it? It just degenerates into sort of this sort of chaotic slagging match that we're so facile today, and I think we're so shallow that we want the instant gratification, and we want to know that we're right, and we want to hear the echo of our voices. It's almost like we want to look in the mirror and just know that we're right in everything we say and do, you know. And the greatest minds in history, the greatest scientists, and the ones who made the greatest discoveries were the ones that were filled with the greatest doubt.
Absolutely. There's another saying there, ignorant people are full of confidence and intelligent people are full of doubt, or something
along those lines. Yeah.
The sentiment again is there, if the quote isn't exactly being nailed.
Yeah. But the politics at the moment is a politics of division, very much so. You see it in this country too. You see it with the vitriol online, especially. Look, it's very easy. One of the greatest scourges of social media is that it's available to everybody, and not everybody's able to handle it. A great portion of people who think that at the first sign of somebody disagreeing with them, that they have to launch all their personal missiles, you know, and launch all the offence they possibly can against this person to try and demean them. That reasonable debate has really gone out the window to a large extent, you know.
That's identity politics right there in a nutshell, though, isn't it? I mean, you have your core set of beliefs, and so does everybody that you associate yourself with, and anybody who disagrees with even the slightest thing is automatically the other. There's a guy, Michael Sherman, I'm a big fan of. He has a great phrase. It's the left pole, or the right pole. So similarly, if you're in the North Pole, every direction is south. Yeah. So if you're on the extreme left, say you're on the left pole. So no matter what direction you look, anyone that's not standing on the same ground that you are is on the right, say.
Yeah. Well, I just don't understand why people have to take up such extreme positions. You know, and I think it's part of the severe lack of maturity. And where does that stem from? I don't really know, except for, of course, we've really strayed out of my comfort zone here now. Except for, I think it does tie in with the whole discussion about, your grounding. So, back in the other interview, we talked about the system and the system becoming a machine and therefore spawning machines.
Feeding itself.
And it's like, well, if a machine decides, or if a machine is programmed to be a right-wing machine, then it's going to be against everything that the left has to say. But the reason a lot of people go into politics is because that they believe they can serve people, and they have a wish to serve people. The reason some people go into politics is to serve themselves, of course. It's inevitable. I just think that ordinary people have never been in such a position to express their opinions openly and widely as they have in the past 5 or 10 years. Never in history. Because what was your previous method? I told you last time, you're printing pamphlets, or you're standing at a street corner with a loud hailer, or you're writing letters to your local newspaper.
Absolutely.
Or you're setting up some sort of a local movement to hold meetings, and you're trying to get the press interested in what you're doing. And it's the only way you can communicate any message that you have.
And you're cycling around delivering pamphlets,
the old-fashioned way. Now...
But we did it.
Oh, I know. Yeah, and I know. Look, mass movements were thus spawned,
But it's too accessible now.
Yeah.
Everyone
There's
can
too
do
many
it.
idiots with opinions,
But everyone can do it, so nobody does it. If that makes sense.
Everybody does it, and everybody thinks that they have an absolute right, and that. Oh, look, you see an awful lot of stuff online. I see local politicians on Facebook, and I wonder, why the hell are you on Facebook? Because you're getting awful grief,
Yeah, of course, yeah.
They make an announcement, and it's a positive announcement, and somebody's saying, what about this, and what about that, and you haven't done that about this, and you're only out to line your own pockets, and blah, blah, and suddenly there's threats, and there's intimidation, and there's foul language all over the place. What way are we conducting ourselves, And what do we expect is going to be the outcome of that? Anger. And what is the outcome of anger? Conflict. And what is the outcome of conflict? Suffering.
Yeah, division.
It's going nowhere, But not to be too pessimistic.
But what does the mythology tell us? What are the lessons that you've learned, say, over the years to that would help guide us? Not that you have all the answers, but I mean you've gone down this rabbit hole.
Well,
and you've been living in it for 20
I hate to sound
years.
like a broken record, but we all the way back to the same set of myths in the Lower Gawala, and the fact that rather than annihilating the Milesians, the Dadanans eventually reached an accord with them, which I think is a very interesting outcome. Given the fact that the Dadanans were apparently deities and were apparently powerful and immortal and all the rest.
And were being invaded. This was their homeland. Say.
By ordinary mortal men. Manannán had the power to scatter their ships at sea. Why didn't they just annihilate them? But instead they allowed them to come, and they made an agreement with them, a compact, or
made peace with them.
An accord, yeah, to use a political term.
Yes.
And
what became of that story then? So they came. The Danan retreated to the Shi.
Yeah.
And was there a resurgence of the Danan? Did they come back at any stage?
They did. They do come back into the stories a few times. Yeah. So that story I was talking about today in my blog, Altram Chia Gawatar, that is set around the time that Christianity is arriving into Ireland. So there's still an influence there, you know.
And sorry, did you say earlier as well that they said they would come back?
There is or there was, when Irish people were still spreading folklore orally, there was a long-standing tradition that they would return. Yeah, that's not something that's written about in the medieval manuscripts. That's something that was spoken about, you know, orally, locally by people in different parts of Ireland.
Because, correct me if I'm wrong here, but Jesus and Muhammad are both to return, you know, to judge the living and the dead, kind of thing. Was that?
There's
there
undoubtedly a sort of a messianic aspect to that mythology. The eternal hope in man for redemption by some great supernatural figure. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, there's definitely a tie-in there. But yes, they did return. I'm trying to think of the other instance that I did think about when you asked me, and it's gone out of my head now. They came back. Oh yeah, they came back to help Finn and the Fianna at the Battle of Fiontree, or the Battle of Ventry.
The Fianna, that's another name.
Yeah.
That's in there somewhere.
People would sort of recognise that. They would sort of be aware of Finn and the Fianna, the great warriors. Now this is a later time. The Finn cycle comes after the mythical cycle, which involves the Leabhar Gabháil and the Dadanans and all that. But they come back to help Finn and the Fianna in their battle against Dara Dun and the armies of the world who come to take Ireland. And spoiler alert, the Fianna and the Dadanans are victorious against all of these massed forces that are coming. It's an interesting one, you know. Yeah, so they do re-enter the fray, as it were, you know, at various times. So they don't just disappear into the Shee, and that's the end of the Dadanans, and no more was heard from them. The end, you know, that's not the way it is. See, for a lot of people, the Dadanans are ever living, you know, and their mythology lives on, and they're of all of the things that have happened, or all of the things that are described in myths, or all the mythical events and happenings and peoples, the Tuatha Dé Danann seem to engender the most interest. You know, I'm not really sure why, but there's an endearing nature to them, and a lasting nature to them. You know, people are interested in the Dé Dananns, and you know, you can't help as a student of mythology kind of becoming enamoured by them, you know.
And you keep referring to them as them. Like, was there 6 of them? Do you know the kind of way? Or
well, you know, there's lots of them, and in fact, you know, there are dozens of them.
But again, you see, you know this, but I and obviously the people listening don't. Do you know that kind of way?
You encounter the same sort of 8 or 10. You know, there's 8 or 10 that stand out.
And were they archetypal? Like, was there, you know, was
yeah,
there...
so there's a smith, Gobnew, and there's a healer, Dian Kecht.
I'm sorry, when you say smith, like a metal smith?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Which is interesting, you know, because if some of these myths are prehistoric and pre-metal, it's interesting that there should be a metal worker among them. There are several female deities. There are deities who have been sort of associated with war and conflict, like Macha and Morrigan and Bob, which are all seen as variants of the same goddess. There's Dagda, who's very much the chief of the gods. There's Manannán, who's like a sea god, you know. Ogma, who I think some people have tried to link his name with Ogham, that he might be a god of something to do with writing, etc., etc. But he's one of the chiefs as well. Then there's Bridget, and she's supposed to have been the sort of like the patron of poets and artists and writers. And interestingly, it is commonly believed that the Bridget, the goddess, who was a daughter of the Dagda, is the same woman who later became transformed into the Christian saint, Saint Bridget, you know.
Yeah.
That there are people, quite a lot of people actually, interested in Bridget, but interested in both the goddess and the saint, you know.
And was there a top god? Was there like the equivalent of a Zeus?
Oh yeah, Dagda.
Okay, so sorry. Dagda
Yeah.
was that.
And to a sort of an extent, Manannán, Ogma, and Lu are kind of all up there, you know.
Right.
And then you talk about supreme female deities because it was a pantheon, and of course, although Dagda is kind of referred to as the chief god, there are also sort of supreme female deities. And as I said, like the one there that we would identify with locally is Bowen, from whom the Boyne is named, you know. And the whole valley seems to have been consecrated in her honour, you know. And then you have the likes of Morrigan, which translates as the great queen, you know, Mór Riagan. She's said to have been buried at Brunabonia as well. And then there's a whole sort of series of, like, you've the likes of Bob Jarrag, you know, a son of Dagda who becomes king after Dagda. And then you have a whole load of lesser known or sort of lesser in stature Dedanan gods and figureheads who enter the tales in various forms. So you've guys like Midger, and you have Finbar, and, you know, various others.
And who were these guys? Just if you can give a quick synopsis of each of them.
Not really, to be honest, because, you know, I'm aware of this, the kind of the supreme ones, but the other ones, they get such little mention. It's very hard to concoct, you know, or to construct a sort of a comprehensive overview of them.
But even me learning that's great for me, because at least now I know that I'm not missing out on the story of one of the guys that you mentioned, say.
Yeah.
No, I obviously I'm missing out on some elements, but I'm not missing out on the, you know, the gist of who they were. There's no...
Yeah, you have all the major ones, and if you cover those, you've covered probably 80% of Dedanan mythology. And then you've a host of smaller ones who enter the fray at various times, but who only maybe get mentioned in one or two stories. Whereas, you know, the mythology of the Dagda and Manannán, and especially in relation to Brunabonia, Aengus, Elkmar, and Lu, Nuadu, you know, they're all there, you know, Danu or Anya, you know, as I said, Morrigan, Bob, Macha, Brigid, you know, Bowen. And then there's like what I consider to be a pre-Neolithic deity in the Cailleach, you know, the old hag. Because she is a ubiquitous, like her, she's present in mythology and folklore and in landscape features all around Ireland.
And can you kind of give us her bio, say?
Well, where we encounter her locally in the most spectacular fashion is at Lough Crew, where she is said to have been the one who created the cairns on the hilltops. And there's a creation myth about how the Cailleach was jumping from hill to hill, carrying an apron full of stones. And as she jumped onto each hill, she would drop some to form the cairns. And it says that when she got to the last hill, which is called Patrickstown, she slipped and fell and broke her neck. And thus her creative escapade ended, you know. To me, and I'm following intuition here, which I will later back up with facts, I'm sure. I hope. God, I better. I have a hunch that she is a very ancient figure, and a very ancient deity from Mesolithic or even Paleolithic times, which is interesting because I said, didn't I, the last time, that the Ice Age wiped everything out and we had to start afresh.
But presumably many people migrated from Ireland and then returned. But then again, the Ice Age, did it last 1,000 or a couple of thousand years?
Yeah, I was supposed to look that up because you asked me that the last time and I didn't precisely know, and I didn't look it up, but several thousand years, yeah.
I have a guy coming on, he's a glacial geologist.
Oh, brilliant.
So
well,
he's toured the States. Was it last year or the year before? He's literally toured the States giving talks about glacial geology. So,
yeah.
And he's from the area.
Well, maybe you could extrapolate that information from him, because I'd be very interested in just finding out exactly, and if he had any insight actually into You know, what was likely to have happened to the population? Would they have been able to effect a proper escape into Britain or Europe, or where would they have gone to avoid the calamity of the ice? And yeah, see, what I'm interested in is I mentioned in Mythical Ireland that the myth of the Mata, according to Michael Wentz, who I mentioned the last time, he was the guy that had this controversial theory of two different groups of mythology, and some people said he created a sort of a racist mythology, but he's fascinating nonetheless. He maintains that the story of the killing of the dragon or the beast is at least 20,000 years old. So in that time frame, it's like if the Mata story is a really ancient story, is it pre-Ice Age? And therefore the question is, did it, as you maybe speculate there, did it migrate with people from Ireland into Europe and come back again with the new settlers whenever they came back after the ice retreated? You know,
it would be kind of maybe instinctive is the wrong word, but that makes sense to me, because my understanding of ice ages is that it's not as if, you know, what's that over there? Oh my God, it's a giant ice sheet. Run. Do you know that kind of way? Like, it got progressively colder. So it was a degree or two colder maybe every year. And
it's
animals
a slow
know to...
creeping process.
Absolutely. Yeah. But animals know to migrate away from such conditions. So why we wouldn't almost makes no sense. So presumably we did get the fuck out of Dodge, say, and return.
Yeah, I think because life's going to become unbearable. Whatever but the cold. Humans can live in cold.
Yes, of course,
like the Eskimos, you know. The point is that when the cold is an ice sheet that is covering everything that you can hunt and grow, then when you can't eat ice,
yes,
it's not going to keep you alive.
Of course.
You know, then you have to flee, you know. What I'm interested in about the Mata story is the Mata was said to have licked up the Boyne till it became...
So this Mata is this kind of...
The monster.
The monster, yes,
yeah.
Okay.
He licked up the Boyne until it became a dry river valley. Was he a glacier?
Okay.
Is that a story about a glacier gouging out the valley? Because that's how the Boyne Valley was formed.
Of course, yeah, absolutely.
Glacier, or, you know, the movement of ice was what formed a lot of the landscape that we know today.
Formed it all.
All the drumlins and all the moraines and all the stuff.
Yeah.
Geographical term. Yes, Anthony, stuff.
Stop blinding us with all this jargon.
Yeah. This jargon, yeah. But no, from my limited understanding of it, I'm just interested in that idea that maybe the Mata, there is an element of that story that refers to the ice sheets gouging up the landscape, you know.
Well, here's an interesting take on the idea of a dragon, which apparently is synonymous with all cultures. And this is I'm taking this from Jordan Peterson. Now, I don't know if this is his idea or if he's just repeating somebody else's words, but the idea of the dragon was that it was the embodiment of all our primal fears. So when we were literally monkeys, well before we were humans or anything like even an early human, or maybe just an early human, say, we would have been preyed upon by snakes, cats, large birds. Was there another one? Snakes, cats, large birds. But even just if you combine the three of them, you've got the claws of the cat, the kind of the body of the snake, and it could fly.
Yeah.
So that was the idea of a dragon was essentially an archetypal ultimate predator. It was all your fears. It was the worst thing possible.
Okay, yeah, makes a certain amount of sense, doesn't it?
So I just thought I'd throw that out there. But Jordan Peterson, he's certainly a man that you're really gonna like. He's a massive student of Jung and Nietzsche and Campbell. He did a series only recently called the psychological significance of the biblical stories. A very controversial figure, but a fascinating character. Really fascinating guy. He speaks a lot about this idea of the shadow as Jung did.
Yeah.
I couldn't recommend him to you and to everybody.
Must have a look.
Everyone listening.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah.
But lest I forget, there was a comment on YouTube in relation to your conversation with me the last day. Did you get a chance to read it by chance?
Yes.
So why
I
didn't you
did.
tell me about the tunnels to Egypt, Anthony?
Well, Fran, that's because the aforementioned tunnels linking Ireland to Egypt don't exist.
You can't prove they don't
Shockingly.
exist, though.
Well, do you know what? If I was a betting man, I'd bet me house on it. Yeah, no, there's a thing that's been shared widely on social media claiming that there's a Stone Age tunnel system all over Europe. Yes, there are Stone Age tunnels, and yes, there are tunnels that are of prehistoric age in different European countries. No, they're not connected. No, it's not possible to walk from Ireland to continental Europe or Africa via tunnel. What nonsense, you know? It's like, come on, guys.
The truth is out there, Anthony. Open your
Look,
eyes. Get off your knees.
There's a lot of there's a folk tale that's common around Ireland that different sacred sites are linked by underground tunnels. Now, I think that's partly derived by the existence of so many souterrains, because there are a lot of souterrains in Ireland which are medieval structures that were used either for, or probably for both, storing grain and food and keeping it cool, and also as hiding places from Viking raids. So I think that's likely to stem from that. The idea of sacred sites being linked by tunnels, to me, suggests that they're actually linked in true cosmology or astronomy, that if there's a story about two sites that are linked, it may be that they're linked through a solstitial sunrise alignment or some sort of a lunar alignment. I don't know. That's speculation on my part, just intuitive speculation on my part. But no, there are no tunnels linking Dublin with the Giza.
So you say.
Or Newgrange. Ironically, something that is true is that Newgrange is located exactly 1/10 of the Earth's circumference from the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is 36 degrees of arc from Newgrange to Giza.
This is the type of thing now that I've heard people complain about Graham Hancock.
Yeah.
That
It's a bit too far out.
Well, the idea, the complaint that I've heard is basically that pick 2 points on the Earth, and it's bound to be, 1/100th of something, or twice something else.
Okay, that's fine, and I understand that argument, but this isn't two arbitrary random points. What is the largest and most famous prehistoric monument in Ireland? It's Newgrange. What is the largest, most famous prehistoric monument in Egypt? It's the Great Pyramid of Giza. So that ain't a coincidence. We're not just picking two arbitrary points there.
True.
But I'm not defending it. I'm just saying it's fascinating. I'm not saying that the people who built Newgrange, people who built Giza, if you believe the chronology, that the pyramids came after Newgrange.
What's your take on that? Because is there a bit of what does the literature say? Like, if I was to Google it now, how old is Newgrange and how old is the pyramids?
About 3,150 BC, give or take a century, and the pyramids are approximately Newgrange, Stonehenge, pyramids. Pyramids are 1,000 years later, I think. 500 or 1,000. No, newer.
Okay, I thought the pyramids were about 5,000 years old.
Less, apparently.
Okay.
I don't know how they can prove that.
Newgrange is
The great thing about Newgrange and Nouth and Douth is that they're earthen mounds with faunal or plant remains in them that can be carbon dated.
Oh, lovely.
In the layerings.
But presumably there's the same in the pyramids.
Don't think so. It's all just stone upon stone upon stone.
But sure, I've been in them. So, now I obviously didn't see any artefacts because, they've obviously been put into museums since, but they had large cavities, they had large passageways.
Yes, yeah.
And, tombs containing... They've germinated seeds, I think, out of the pyramids in Giza, have they not? I think so.
But I think the pyramids are generally dated later to Newgrange anyway. Well, that's what's claimed here anyway, that Newgrange is older than the pyramids. I do think it's fascinating that they're separated by that coincidental distance. Was that intended? Well, geez, that's very hard to argue, isn't it?
I know what you mean. Yeah, no. Who knows?
It's unlikely, but you can never say never.
No, absolutely. You have to keep an open mind. But, as another saying goes, keep an open mind, but not so open that your brain falls out. Love that one.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Which again comes back to the point of you can enjoy reading somebody, but if their ideas seem a little bit too far out, then acknowledge that, you know.
Of course.
It's just that there are a lot of people out there just willing to read almost anything that they encounter, and they're not able to critically analyze it, you know.
Of course, of course.
It's like, what is the likelihood of that based upon evidence and, you know, criteria that you might establish to prove it or disprove it, you know? Does anybody ever have that discussion, or did they just read a book? Oh, that's amazing! Yeah, can't believe that Newgrange was used as a navigational beacon for UFOs, you know, without ever questioning it. You know, well, hang on, you know, is it possible that it was just built by ordinary men and women?
Of course, yeah.
You know,
yeah,
no, it has to be built by aliens. God damn it!
Come here, Anthony. But before I let you go, I have to get a couple of questions over to you that have come in from the listeners. So,
oh, great.
One, but the most common one was what you thought of that comment that was on left on the YouTube video. The other ones were, apparently there was or is going to be a big dig at Doubt, and that there's some large discovery that's been made that's been kept on the QT and very hush hush. Do you know anything about that, or do you know what that person might be alluding to, or?
Okay, well, there has been no archaeological digging at Doubt, as in the megalithic passage tomb of Doubt, sister site of Newgrange. None.
Okay.
There is a plan to carry out an archaeological excavation of a deserted medieval village in the immediate vicinity of Doubt, the same field. Not far from there is Doubt Hall, which contains the remains of one of the most substantial late Neolithic or early Bronze Age henges, an embanked enclosure, ingloriously called Site Q, or the Doubt Henge. Archaeologists have been on site there for the past few years. I'm not aware that any substantial digging has taken place at the henge itself. I'm aware that some limited amount of digging has taken place in the grounds. There was an investigation of a mound down near the river that it looked like a mound, but there was no evidence visually that it could be a passage tomb. And there was a limited excavation took place there. The results haven't been published to my knowledge, but information has come to me that dig has suggested that this is just a natural feature and is not a man-made mound. But we await the publication of results. What's fascinating about Site Q Henge is that the two openings, I wrote about this in Island of the Setting Sun, the two openings are aligned on summer solstice sunrise, and it was long thought that one of the openings wasn't original with the mound, that it had been broken open at some stage in recent history to allow for the passing of agricultural machinery. It is my information now that it's more likely that opening is actually original to the mound. There are other features in that landscape that I think are going to prove very fascinating. One of them is what's called a ceremonial or a raised routeway that appears to lead from the passage tomb of Doubt through the lands at Doubt Hall over to that henge. And it stops at the southwestern entrance and then re-emerges again at the northeastern entrance. And this raised routeway of unknown date may be a prehistoric feature. So there's definitely interesting stuff to come out of Doubt Hall. I'm not sure that there's been any major discovery. That could be just speculation. Or maybe I just don't know.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Another question.
Which is possible.
Of course. Another question that came in was in relation to the building of the M3, specifically from Tara towards Navan direction. And somebody wrote in basically saying that a lot of stuff was uncovered and they just basically took note of the GPS coordinates and just kind of ploughed on. Now, I remember at the time when all that controversy was going on, my own opinion at the time again was, look, you can't stick a shovel in the ground in Ireland without digging up some sort of ancient site of some description. How accurate is that mentality? Or, I mean, should the road have been built? Have you any particular opinion on it yourself? Was it too close? Or
Yeah, look, I disagreed with the routing of the M3 at the time. Didn't see the sense of routing it through the Gowra Valley between Tara and Screen. It actually took a serious detour from the straight line route, which would have been to the west of the Hill of Tara. It was always controversial. A lot of people were arguing that the railway line should have been rebuilt. There was an existing track bed there from Dublin to Navan. The route of the motorway maybe should have changed. Some people were arguing for a widening of the existing N3. You know, maybe a contraflow, 2 lanes in one direction, 1 lane in the other, etc., reversing in the evening for the evening rush hour. There's much bigger debates there anyway, which is the sustainability of, you know, road transport, and why we seem to have such a fascination with it in Ireland, and why we have completely and abysmally failed when it comes to mass transport and public transport systems. And even our fastest railway capability is 90 miles per hour, or whatever that equivalent is in kilometers per hour. We have probably the slowest intercity train speeds in Europe, which is a sad reflection on us. In relation to the archaeology, yes, it's very true that if you dig in Ireland, you're going to encounter archaeology. It is not true that they just recorded the GPS coordinates and then covered everything over or dug everything up. What happened was what they call preservation by record, a full archaeological investigation or excavation of the sites that were uncovered was undertaken. They were all recorded and photographed, and then the motorway was built. Look, it's a controversial area. I think most followers of Mythical Ireland will know my stance on it, which is I was against the routing, and I think you can't be ploughing big motorways and associated junctions and possible future retail and industrial parks in the vicinity of sensitive archaeological landscapes such as the Hill of Tara. At the same time, what they unearthed, for instance, at Lismullen was a henge, a series of post holes. One could argue that there wasn't much left to preserve. I'm not defending the building of the motorway, and I'm not defending that crazy period of time. By the way, within a few months of the M3 opening, the government and the economy collapsed. So there is a message there, I think. You shouldn't sometimes just plough your way with abandon through such a pristine and a major archaeological landscape. And some people are saying that the government was warned, against it, and it was bad news because, as I said, no sooner had it opened than everything crashed.
Yeah,
ironically,
more or less, yeah.
know.
And there wasn't as much of a need of it as there was, or if there was any need for it.
And of course, they plonked loads of tolls on it, which meant a whole lot of people wouldn't use it anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's the sense of it all, really? Yeah, I was kind of depressed about it. Having said that, I use motorways to get to and from work, so it's a bit two-faced of me to say I'm not against motorways per se, but I just do think that we're very short-sighted in relation to our overall vision. And unfortunately, archaeology suffers. It always does. Archaeology is such a minor concern for most for most politicians and for most big business.
Is it because we have so much of it?
No. I just
not archaeology, but
I
stuff to dig up, basically.
Yeah, I don't think we appreciate it. I don't think we appreciate what we have, and we are actually slowly getting rid of it piece by piece as time goes on. More damage has been done by human hands to our archaeology in the past century than has been done by any other factor.
Of course.
So we've lost an awful lot, actually. However, there is an argument to be made that, if there are 40 or 50,000 ring forts, does it matter if one or two of them are lost here and there? but just depends on your standpoint, you know.
And in relation to what we do have left, did I hear you mention that you were organising a tour of, the name always escapes me, over Oldcastle direction? You're being attacked there by a spider, I think, are you?
Yes, you noticed. Sorry, I apologise.
You're right. But you're organising a tour of, where is it, over Oldcastle direction?
Loughcrew.
Loughcrew, could never think of the name of Loughcrew.
Yeah, the locals there are organising a series of events around the spring equinox, which is a big deal at Loughcrew because Cairntee is aligned towards the rising sun on the spring and the autumn equinox. Yeah, there's going to be a 3-day sort of equinox festival, as it were, on the St. Patrick's weekend.
Okay.
I think that's Saturday the 18th, and Sunday the 19th, and Monday the 20th. I hope I have my dates right. And as part of that, the plan is that there's going to be a walk. No, I'm wrong. It's Sunday the 18th, Monday the 19th. Yes, Saturday the 17th, Sunday the 18th, and Monday the 19th. There's going to be a walk of the landscape by local guide Malachi Hand, and that will encompass some of the hills of Loughcrew and over then to Cairntee. And I'm going to be giving a talk as well about my latest work, my latest book, which contains quite a substantial section about Loughcrew. That'll feature some of my photographs as well, so that'll be interesting, you know.
No, brilliant. And listen, anybody who's listening, anybody who's stayed with us this long now, we're a couple of minutes past the 3-hour mark.
It's an endurance award you need.
But put it this way, anybody who's lasted this long is interested in this event in Loughcrew.
Yeah.
So will the details, like the specifics, be up on your Facebook page?
Yes,
or?
That's actually the one place that I will be most likely to publicise is on the Facebook page, facebook.com/Mythical Ireland.
Okay, and as we did in the wrap up for our last conversation, I'm just going to get you to rhyme off the usual places or the places where your work can be found and where people who've enjoyed this can kind of learn a bit more.
Yeah, well, my website is mythicalireland.com, or mythicalireland.ie takes you to the same place. Facebook is facebook.com/Mythical Ireland. So they're the two most substantially used media, as it were, for my work. I'm on Twitter, twitter.com/Mythical Ireland. I'm on Instagram as Mythical Ireland. I'm on Flickr as Mythical Ireland. And I'm on Patreon, patreon.com/Mythical Ireland. So, you know, if you want to support what I do and help me to turn it into a vocation and to keep unearthing and digging away at these myths and trying to find meaning in everything, then I'd appreciate your support. And of course, don't forget you can buy my books as well. You know, my books are sort of really where my work has taken the most concrete form, as it were. So if you just search for Anthony Murphy on Amazon, you'll find all my books on there.
I don't think we've mentioned that you're a photographer in the 6 odd hours that we've been talking.
Well, maybe briefly. Yeah, that's been a sort of a long-standing passion or hobby of mine, and it's been great actually for Mythical Ireland as a project because it's enabled me to present a very visual side of the monuments and the landscape to followers of Mythical Ireland, both on the website and on Facebook, and indeed in my books, because that's where people can actually see, you know, pictures of the things that I'm describing. So it's all my own photography that's in the books, which is great. I didn't have to go begging, borrowing and stealing, not that I'd steal, photographs from other sources, you know. So it's a big passion of mine.
Well, the images are fantastic, and your book Mythical Ireland that you so kindly lent me the last day you were here, I haven't gotten to it yet because it's just time, you know yourself. I'm busier than most, but I have had a quick flick through it, and the pictures in it, if nothing else, are just amazing. They really, really are, and I love the idea of maybe picking a couple and buying them from you. Or they're available. You can buy them through the website, can't you?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I sell prints on the website. Yeah.
I love the idea of getting a print from the website and hanging it in my house, because as almost a constant reminder of, you know, essentially where I come from. Because and I think there's something really kind of poetic about having a photo of whatever it is, whether it's something up in Loughcrew or whether it's Newgrange or some monument or whatever it is in Ireland.
Yeah.
Having that hanging pride of place in your home, I think is akin to having, you know, a picture of the Virgin Mary, you know, 50 years ago or more recently, or whatever. It's something. We're of it. You know,
Yeah.
Irish people are of these stories and these places.
Yeah, yeah.
But Anthony, listen, it's an absolute pleasure having you on again. I must get you to do up a list of questions for Robbie Meehan, who'll be joining me in the next month or so, the glacial geologist. So if you have any questions like that,
Yeah, I'd be very interested
yeah, no,
in
absolutely.
listening to him. Yeah.
I'd very much like to get you back on once I've digested Mythical Ireland. So we might leave it another while, but
Yeah.
you're an absolute friend of the show, a man certainly living his life off the lead. I wish you all the very best, particularly with your Patreon account. And to the people listening, get on the whole Patreon buzz. I mean, you can go on. I've committed to it now. I'm giving you €1 a month.
Yeah.
And I give all the other guys that I follow their work on Patreon €1 a month. And I love the idea of contributing to the people that I love consuming their work, basically. And I'm a big proponent of this idea of paying for what you want to see more in the world. So if for example, just to flesh that out a little bit, if you don't like McDonald's and if you don't like factory farming, don't eat at McDonald's. If you've enjoyed this conversation, throw €1 a month to your Patreon account, or more if you can afford it.
Yeah.
And start supporting the things that, you know, have some meaning and some purpose, and, you know, will generally improve the world.
Yeah. It's a very nice way of putting it, actually. Yeah.
But yeah, listen, again, an absolute pleasure having you on, and I look forward to the next time we speak.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been fascinating.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much,
Fran.
sir.